Hercule Poirot and The Last Words of a Dying Spy. Chapter 1. The Last Breath at Birkwood Hall. It was just after midnight when the heavy oak doors of Birkwood Hall groaned shut behind the last of the evening's guests. The estate, nestled deep in the Sussex countryside, had hosted a discreet soirée, small, elegant, and attended only by those who knew to keep secrets. Lady Isabel Halberd, widow of the late Sir Giles Halberd, had insisted on celebrating her birthday in the same room where her husband had once toasted the king long before his sudden and discreet retirement from the War Office. The air outside had cooled, and the scent of damp yew drifted in through the tall French windows, cracked slightly open in defiance of the butler's repeated protestations. Inside the drawing-room, a solitary man leaned against the grand piano, his silhouette outlined by the flicker of dying firelight. Major Miles Prothero, once of MI6 and now a reluctant guest, poured himself a final brandy. He had not come for celebration. He had come, he said, for closure. But closure was not what he found. At precisely 12:17 a.m., a shot rang out, a singular clipped report that silenced the house like a dropped curtain in a theatre. By the time Lady Isabel's guests had gathered their wits and descended to the conservatory, the scene they found was one of chilling finality. Major Prothero lay sprawled beneath the window, blood darkening the polished marble floor. His eyes, still faintly open, stared towards the night sky, as if he had glimpsed something just before the end. Lady Isabel's personal maid, trembling, with a silver tray in hand, insisted she had heard the Major whisper something, barely audible, choked by the blood in his throat. 3 words, only 3, Blackbird, Algernon, betrayed, and then he was gone. The local constabulary, headed by the brisk but baffled Inspector Graves, arrived within the hour. The doors had been locked from the inside. The guest list was short, exclusive, and, on paper, entirely respectable. No one had entered or left since the stroke of 11. A dying spy, a locked room mystery, a whispered name. It was Lady Isabel herself who made the call the next morning. She did not trust the police to untangle the delicate threads that bound her guests together, not with wartime secrets still echoing through the halls of Birkwood. She made her request with the same elegance that had once charmed ambassadors and generals. Monsieur Poirot, we are in need of your little grey cells, and your utmost discretion. Soon, the afternoon train from London, Hercule Poirot arrived at Birkwood Hall, flanked by Captain Hastings, who, though slightly more greying than in his earlier adventures, remained keenly observant and rather thrilled by the air of espionage hanging over the affair. Poirot stepped off the train with impeccable poise. His attire was, as ever, immaculate. Dove-grey gloves, precisely knotted cravat, and his moustache. Ah, magnifique, curved like a symphony of symmetry and style. He glanced around at the waiting motor car, then at the landscape. It is always in the countryside, Hastings, where the darkest secrets are kept, he murmured. The trees, they whisper at night, but they do not speak plainly. Hastings chuckled, clutching his suitcase. Sounds more like a job for a cryptographer than a detective. Poirot's expression did not change. And yet, it is human nature that must be decoded, not Morse code, Mon ami, as the motor car rumbled toward the looming silhouette of Birkwood Hall, Poirot reviewed the preliminary facts presented to him in Lady Isabel's elegantly written letter. Major Miles Prothero, retired intelligence officer, unmarried, no known enemies, at least none who had survived the war. Guests present included Lady Isabel Halberd, elegant hostess with discreet ties to the War Office; Algernon Fitz, a charming ex-diplomat whose name had once been whispered in scandal; Dr. Vivian Knox, neurologist and wartime medical consultant, Reverend Julian Markham; local vicar, former chaplain to military officers, Charles and Miranda Vale, a couple known for philanthropic work and rumours of discreet intelligence operations, Colonel Sebastian Rathmore, brusque, reclusive, and once tasked with rooting out enemy moles. Tight circle, every one of them with reason to bury secrets, every one of them with potential access to Prothero in his final hours. Birkwood Hall emerged from behind the trees as the motor car rounded the drive, its red brick facade bathed in the pale gold light of approaching dusk. Poirot smoothed his gloves as the car stopped. "Come, Hastings, let us meet this circle of secrecy. A man is dead, but even in silence he has spoken." Hastings raised a brow. "You believe those 3 words meant something concrete?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, mais oui. One does not invoke the name of a blackbird without meaning. And Algernon, a name, yes, but also perhaps a key." He stepped onto the gravel path. "Now, let us see what truths lie beneath polished manners and birthday champagne. The spy may be dead, Hastings, but the game, c'est à peine commencé. It has only just begun." Chapter 2. The gathering of suspect Captain Hastings would later say that there was something curiously theatrical about the way Lady Isabel greeted them at the steps of Birkwood Hall, as though she had been rehearsing her lines in front of a mirror until the very moment their motor car arrived. Dressed in a tailored cream gown that offered both mourning and dignity, her bearing was regal and self-assured, though her eyes betrayed fatigue. She extended her gloved hand to Poirot with effortless grace. "Monsieur Poirot, thank you for coming, and Captain Hastings, welcome." Poirot bowed gently, his fingers brushing her hand with old-world elegance. "Lady Isabel, it is I who am honoured. To be invited into this drama, one must presume, of the most delicate nature." Her smile was tight. Delicate, yes, that is a very polite way of putting it. Inside, the hall had the faded opulence of an old aristocracy, adapting to post-war austerity. Rich rugs muffled their footsteps, and family portraits loomed along the corridor. Stern, men in uniforms, stoic women draped in jewels. A portrait of Sir Giles Halberd presided over the drawing-room, square-jawed, decorated, and dead these past 10 years. Poirot's gaze lingered on the painting. "Sir Giles, your late husband?" "Lady," Isabel's eyes flicked up to it. "Yes, intelligence attaché during the war. We met in Cairo, fell in love in Lisbon, married in London, and played chess with secrets until the day he died." Hastings cleared his throat awkwardly. "So, he also, well, dealt in espionage?" "Everyone in our circle has, Captain Hastings," she said lightly. "The only question now is which of us has continued to. They were escorted to the morning room where tea had been laid out, though no one seemed interested in it. Poirot and Hastings were introduced to the guests, each of whom had been asked, gently but firmly, to remain on the estate until Poirot's arrival. It was, in Lady Isabel's words, a matter of shared discretion. No one had objected. Perhaps that was the most telling detail of all. Poirot stood in the centre of the room, turning slowly, examining each face as though they were already suspects in a gallery of guilt. "Let us be clear, mesdames et messieurs," he began with quiet authority. "I am not here to question your patriotism, your loyalty, or your past allegiances. I am here because a man has died, not just any man, but one of your own, Major Miles Prothero." He paused, and with his final breath he uttered 3 words: Blackbird, Algernon, betrayed. I am certain you all understand the implications. A rustle moved through the room, subtle, restrained, but perceptible. Poirot continued, "Lady Isabel has kindly provided me with the guest list and background, but it is not the facts that interest me most. No, it is what lies beneath them, the inconsistencies, the truths you do not speak, the secrets you carry." He turned to the nearest figure. "Let us begin, shall we?" Algernon Fitz was lounging by the fireplace, a glass of Scotch in hand, and the faint smile of a man who found everything vaguely amusing. Slender, fair-haired, and immaculately dressed, he seemed cut from the cloth of clubland diplomats, the sort who always had a passport and a mistress. He rose with lazy politeness. "You've come to interrogate me, I imagine, Monsieur Poirot, given that my name was one of the 3 words uttered by a dying man." Poirot inclined his head. "Interrogate, monsieur? No, I wish to understand." Fitz gave a small bow and settled into a chair. "Understand what? That Miles and I served in similar circles, that we crossed paths in Istanbul, Algiers, and once, memorably, in Athens during a blackout." "Did you consider him a friend?" Fitz paused, the smile fading a fraction. "Friendship is a dangerous word in our profession. We trusted each other situationally. I respected him." "Then what might he have meant by saying your name? Algernon, it is not so common that it would have been confused." Another pause. Fitz's voice dropped half an octave. "He may have suspected something, or someone, or he may have simply remembered the wrong moment at the wrong time." Poirot made a small note on his pad. "The dying mind is curious, Monsieur Fitz. It does not invent, but it prioritizes." Next came Dr. Vivian Knox, who observed Poirot with an analytical sharpness that mirrored his own. With dark eyes, neatly cropped hair, and a tailored jacket, she had the bearing of someone who had treated men under fire and come out the stronger for it. "I was in the library when the shot was heard," she said crisply, "reading." "Or trying to. You'll find no inconsistencies in my alibi." "I am not here to catch inconsistencies yet, madame," Poirot replied gently, "only to observe the manner in which people present them." "You want psychology?" she said, folding her arms. "Very well. Miles was paranoid. He always believed someone was still watching him. Perhaps he was right." "Did he ever speak of Blackbird?" Her expression shifted barely. "Yes. Once, he said it had been a code name, but he didn't explain more. Did he fear for his life? I think he feared for his past. Whatever happened to him during the war, he carried it with him like a tumour. Poirot tapped the side of his temple. Indeed, the past is where the murder begins, not in the weapon, but in the mind. Colonel Sebastian Rathmore was as blunt as a hammer, and built like one too. A man of few words, most of them delivered with the force of a reprimand. Major Prothero and I served together briefly. I didn't like him, he said simply. Why not, Colonel? He had the habit of looking at everyone as if they were lying. Perhaps they were, but I've always believed trust is a soldier's shield, even among spies. Rathmore's eyes hardened, especially among spies. Then, do you have any thoughts on what Blackbird could refer to? I've heard the name. A covert operation, supposedly. But details were never clear. It was scrubbed from the records and betrayed. The Colonel did not flinch. Everyone feels betrayed in that world. Eventually, you stop caring who did the betraying. The Vales, Charles and Miranda, were polished and pleasant. Charles was the quieter of the two, but Miranda sparkled with the sort of brightness that often concealed razor-sharp awareness. They sat close together, hands almost but not quite touching. "We were in the conservatory," Miranda said. "It was a warm evening, and Charles had begun sketching again. The glass ceiling lets the stars in." Poirot tilted his head. "You are artists?" "Not professionally. Charles is a bit of a polymath. I dabble. Did you hear the shot?" "We did," Charles said softly, "and came running." Miranda screamed when she saw him. Poirot studied them. Had Major Prothero ever confided in you? Charles shook his head. Miranda hesitated. He once said that retirement was just another word for watching shadows grow longer. That's all. Do you know what Blackbird might signify? Miranda glanced down. I thought it was a nursery rhyme. Last was Reverend Julian Markham, the local vicar with a soft voice and worn hens. Poirot found him gazing out over the gardens. You seem troubled, Monsieur le Révérend. I am. Death always troubles me, especially when it visits without warning. You were in the chapel, I am told. Yes, I had gone for a short prayer. The door was open. Did you know Major Prothero? I knew of him. He came to my sermons sometimes, but rarely stayed after. I sensed he did not believe much in salvation. And yet he whispered in death. A confession, perhaps. Markham looked at him. Or an accusation. Poirot paused. Do you believe in redemption, Monsieur Markham? For some, not for all. As dusk began to settle, Poirot returned to the drawing-room with Hastings. The suspects had scattered, some to their rooms, others to silent corners of the estate. Hastings leaned in. Well, what do you make of it? Do you think Algernon? Fitz is our man. Poirot tapped his fingers together. No, Hastings! Fitz is many things. Vain, evasive, perhaps hiding something, but not careless. And a careless man would not have allowed his name to be spoken as a clue. Then what's next? Poirot stood and moved to the window, gazing out toward the conservatory where the body had been found. We begin, mon ami, not with the crime, but with the words. He spoke them aloud again, soft as a whisper. Blackbird, Algernon, betrayed. Then, turning sharply, he added, and we ask not what they mean. But why, that is what a dying man chose to say. Chapter 3. Shadows in the conservatory. Next morning dawned grey and overcast, the kind of English morning that seemed suspended in indecision. Neither rain nor sun, but something muted between. Poirot preferred such weather for investigations. Under harsh sunlight, people postured. In gloom, they revealed themselves. Breakfast at Birkwood Hall was a formal affair despite the circumstances. The long oak table, polished to a dull gleam, was sparsely populated. A few of the guests appeared, but most kept to themselves. Lady Isabel sat at the head, wearing an expression of cold composure. Algernon Fitz nursed a cup of coffee, as if it were an art piece. Dr. Knox read The Times, with surgical attention. Miranda Vale stirred her tea slowly, eyes distant. Poirot ate little, but observed much. He had already decided that today he would return to the conservatory, the place where death had spoken its final words. By mid-morning, Poirot, Hastings and Inspector Merrick, a gruff Scotland Yard man assigned to the official side of the case, stood within the conservatory. Its high glass ceiling arched overhead like a cathedral of glass. Dust motes shimmered in the filtered light. The flowers, though meticulously arranged, seemed unaware of the tragedy that had occurred among them. "This is where he fell?" Poirot asked quietly. Merrick nodded, tapping his boot on the tiled floor. "Right there. The body's position suggested he had staggered a few steps before collapsing. Shot once. Back of the shoulder. Bullet went through the lung." Poirot crouched and examined the faint outline still visible on the floor. "And you believe the shot was fired from here?" He pointed toward the northeast corner, where a large ficus tree stood beside a stone bench. "Most likely," Merrick said. "Angle and trajectory line up. No signs of a struggle. Killer knew the place well." "And the weapon? Small caliber pistol. Silenced, judging by the lack of noise reported by the others. No casing found." "Professional then," Merrick grunted. "Wouldn't be the first time spies used their skills for personal scores." Poirot rose and stepped toward the window. The glass panes bore no fingerprints, cleaned too recently. He turned back toward the center of the room and let his gaze sweep the space slowly, methodically, as if listening for the memory of what had occurred. There were no signs of forced entry. None. Whoever did it came through the house. Poirot nodded. And yet the killer left no trace. That, Inspector, is a trace in itself. Hastings was sketching the layout of the conservatory as Poirot walked slowly between the plants. He paused by a withered orchid, one that had clearly not received the same care as the others. "A curious flower to neglect," he murmured. Hastings looked up. "You think it matters?" Poirot didn't answer. He moved to a tall glass cabinet nestled between the planters. Inside were gardening tools, spades, clippers, gloves, and a small bottle with a faded label, Digitalis Tincture. His eyebrow twitched. "Poison?" Hastings asked. Poirot shook his head. "Unlikely in this case, but its presence suggests someone here understood how to kill, not just why." He examined the surrounding tiles, tapping lightly with the tip of his shoe. In one corner, near a shallow floor drain, he found a small scrap of cloth. A corner of a handkerchief, perhaps, frayed and blood-stained. "Ah!" he whispered. Merrick leaned in. We missed that. Poirot's fingers brushed it lightly. Or perhaps it was meant to be missed, and then found. Later that day, Poirot asked to see Major Prothero's room. Lady Isabel personally led them upstairs. He stayed here, frequently, she explained. After Giles died, Miles would visit when he passed through London. He preferred this room to the guest suites. It was a modest space, surprisingly so. The walls were lined with military books, and the window overlooked the western garden. On the writing desk lay a leather-bound journal, closed but not locked. Poirot gestured. "May I?" "Of course." He flipped it open and scanned the entries. Most were dull records of movements, weather, occasional philosophical musings, but one passage made his eyes narrow. June 4th. The blackbird sings again. Fitz was right to suspect it never stopped. But now the song is out of tune. Someone is pulling the strings. And they're closer than I feared. Interesting metaphor, Hastings murmured. Poirot nodded. Yes, and doubly interesting that he references Algernon Fitz. Fitz claimed suspicion was mutual, but here Miles gives him credit for insight. Curious. Another entry, dated just 2 days before the murder. If I die, let them know I tried to make peace with the ghosts, but one ghost remains unaccounted for, and she watches from within the fold. Poirot closed the journal. That changes things. "Hist, do you think he meant?" Hastings asked. "Lady Isabel, Dr. Knox, Miranda Vale." Poirot didn't answer. His mind was already returning to the scene in the conservatory, to the angle of the shot, the placement of the blood, the discarded cloth. Every element whispered something. That afternoon, Poirot called a private meeting with Lady Isabel. In her private salon, where muted tones of blue and gold echoed elegance, she sat with posture rigid and hands folded in her lap. "I will not pretend I am surprised," she said. "I knew you would want to speak with me alone." Poirot smiled. "Because you knew the questions would come?" "Because I have answers." He inclined his head. "Then I shall ask only one. Did you know what Miles Prothero feared before he died?" She looked away for a moment, out the window towards the gravel path below. "I knew he feared himself, his past, the things he had done in the name of the crown. And you? I knew the past would eventually knock again. I just didn't expect it to bring a gun." Poirot stood. "There is something more you are not telling me, Lady Isabel. Something about the operation known as Blackbird." Her eyes flickered. "That name should have stayed buried. But it did not. And now a man is dead." That night, Poirot paced his room while Hastings snored gently from the adjoining suite. He stared out into the shadows of Birkwood Hall's grounds. In his little notebook he wrote, "Algernon, who matter named by Prothero. A warning or a clue. Blackbird. Code name for mission or person. Betrayed. Action or emotion." He circled the word Blackbird 3 times. Somewhere in this house, the past was not just remembered, it was still alive, and it had killed to stay hidden. Chapter 4. The Smell of Gun Oil Kernel. Archibald Winter was waiting in the study when Hercule Poirot entered with his usual precision. The colonel had the sort of face carved from rough bark, sun-weathered, angular, and deeply furrowed by years of military command. He sat stiffly in a leather-backed chair, arms folded, staring at the fireplace with the unflinching gaze of a man who had faced down enemy artillery and still found British winters more bothersome. Poirot closed the heavy door behind him. "Colonel Winter," he said politely, "a moment of your time, if I may." The colonel didn't rise. "If this is about what I said to that uniformed inspector last night, I meant every word. Man's a windbag. Walks into a murder scene like a fox. In a henhouse." Poirot inclined his head. "Inspector Cobb means well. But yes, it is not about him. I wish to understand the late Mr. Felton's final evening, from your eyes." Winter huffed. "Can't say I liked the fellow. Never did. Clever, secretive type. Looked at you like he was measuring your worth in shillings and pence. Still, no one deserves a bullet through the spine." Poirot gently lowered himself into the chair opposite. "You say you did not like him, and yet you agreed to join this reunion." "He invited me," Winter said brusquely, "and I don't back down from a confrontation. We served together briefly. Burma, 1942. Felton was in signals. Knew more about radios and ciphers than I ever will." "Did he serve well?" Winter narrowed his eyes. "He was efficient. I'll give him that. But always kept himself apart. When the Japanese came down through the hills and everything went to hell, Felton disappeared for 3 days. Came back with a story about ambushed convoys and lost maps. Never sat right with me." Poirot's eyebrows lifted. "And yet he was never accused?" Winter tapped his fingers on the armrest. "No, war's foggy. Heroes and cowards wear the same face in the dark. But I saw enough to know when a man is hiding something. And Felton, he had secrets." Poirot leaned forward. "May I ask where you were at the time of the murder?" "In my room," Winter answered. "Down the corridor from Felton's. I'd just come up from a glass of port with Harrington and Mr. Ames. Retired early, slept badly. Woke when I heard the shouting. That was Harrington." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "You keep a revolver, Colonel?" The question hit the air like a whip crack. Winter's mouth twisted. "Always part of the profession." "And it is kept where?" "In the drawer beside my bed." "May I inspect it?" Winter grunted, but stood and led Poirot up to his chambers. The room, as expected, was meticulous. Everything folded, aligned, soldierly. He opened the bedside drawer and retrieved a Webley revolver. Poirot examined it with gloved hands. "Clean," he noted. "Recently oiled, but no smell of gunpowder. Has it been fired lately?" Winter stiffened. "Not in years." Poirot returned the revolver, nodding. "I am grateful." They returned to the hallway, where Hastings was now chatting amiably with Inspector Cobb, who offered a quick glare in Poirot's direction before excusing himself to speak with the coroner. Poirot beckoned Hastings. "Come, mon ami. We shall speak with Mr. Charles Harrington next. Mr. Harrington," a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous manner, sat by the window of the morning-room, thumbing a leather-bound volume of Kipling. He rose with a start when Poirot and Hastings approached. "I was told I'd be next. Please, do sit. I hardly slept a wink." Poirot observed the man closely. "The death has shaken you, Monsieur Harrington." "It has. God, yes. I knew Felton from our Cambridge days. Brilliant but peculiar, and terribly paranoid." "In what sense?" Hastings asked. Harrington swallowed. He used to speak of coded letters, that someone was watching him. During the war, he believed the Soviets had marked him for assassination. Later he said British intelligence was monitoring his position. Sounded like fantasy, but he always looked over his shoulder. At Birkwood, he insisted the windows be checked, the doors locked. Poirot interlaced his fingers. And last night, I was in the lounge with Ames until about 10. Then I went to the library to fetch a book. Around 10:30, I heard footsteps upstairs, heavy, hurried, then a creak, possibly on the staircase. I assumed it was Felton. He often wandered about at night, but when I went up, it was silent again. Did you see anyone? No, just shadows. I went to my room and started reading. A few minutes later, there was the sound, something like a gasp or a cough. Then silence. I rushed out, found the study door open. Open? Poirot's eyes sharpened. Was the door not locked? I thought so, but it stood ajar. I called out. No answer. That's when I saw him. Felton, collapsed by the fireplace, blood on his collar. I shouted. That's when Cobb arrived. Poirot nodded slowly. Merci, Monsieur Harrington. That is most helpful. When they exited, Hastings looked troubled. All their stories sound too clean, Poirot. Indeed, mon ami. But lies are rarely clever. They fray at the edges. We must merely tug gently. They proceeded next to the east wing, where Miss Evelyn Marchmont awaited. She had requested to speak last, but Poirot insisted she be seen before Lady Willoughby. Miss Marchmont was a striking woman in her late 40s, with dark auburn hair and an impeccably formal manner. She met Poirot's gaze with neither fear nor warmth. Mr. Poirot, she said, I assume you're looking for cracks in my story. I am looking for the truth, mademoiselle, he replied, taking a seat. Your relationship with Mr. Felton? Professional. I've worked for the Foreign Office since 1940. Felton and I intersected on several sensitive matters. Classified. Highly. Poirot tilted his head. Was he trusted? Marchmont's lips tightened. He was brilliant, but he also went dark for several years. After the war, he disappeared into Morocco, then Istanbul. When he resurfaced, he was less British. And was there any fear he had been compromised? A pause. There was speculation, but no evidence. Felton claimed to possess documents that proved a defector in Whitehall. He said he would reveal it soon. Last week he called me out of the blue and asked me to join this reunion. He said everything would become clear. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And did he seem afraid? Always. But this time he was convinced he was about to die. Hastings leaned forward. He mentioned a traitor. To me, yes. He said one of us, one in the house, had betrayed England long ago, and that he had the proof. But he wouldn't say who. Poirot sat back. And where were you when the shot was fired? In my room, writing. I heard a noise, but nothing distinct. Poirot stood. Merci, mademoiselle. Your candour is noted. The corridor, Hastings exhaled. So everyone had a motive, and Felton knew it. This was no random act. It was silencing. Poirot looked out a high window towards the distant treetops. Ah, but who feared his words most? The answer, Hastings, lies not in what Felton possessed, but in who believed he would speak. and behind Poirot's eyes the little grey cells were already aligning. Chapter 5. The Letter That Vanished. The breakfast table at Birkwood Hall bore all the charm of English tradition. Polished silver teapots, soft-boiled eggs in porcelain cups, and golden toast stacked neatly in racks. But the conversation was anything but domestic. Hastings pushed aside his plate. Not one of them seems entirely innocent. Poirot, dabbing his mouth with a napkin, nodded. "Non, mon ami. Each one clings to a past that does not wish to be uncovered." And someone feared that Felton would pull the curtain back. Before Hastings could respond, the butler entered quietly. "Begging your pardon, sirs," he said, "but Miss Marchmont has requested you come to the drawing-room immediately. She's found something, says it may be important." Poirot rose instantly. "Come, Hastings, the game advances." Miss Evelyn Marchmont stood beside the fireplace in the drawing-room, holding a single sheet of paper in her gloved hand. Her eyes were sharp, her posture ramrod straight. "I found this hidden behind the mirror frame in my bedroom," she said without greeting. "Folded twice, unmarked envelope." She handed the paper to Poirot. It was typewritten, no date, no salutation. "You think you have silenced the past, but it still speaks. I know what you did in Rangoon. I know who paid you. I know how the signals were intercepted. When I show them the file, your name will be dust. Meet me in the study at 11:30. No more lies. There was no signature." Poirot studied it carefully. Whoever this was meant for, he or she was accused of treason. The reference to Rangoon suggests the Burma campaign. Miss Marchmont nodded. "That narrows it to 3 of us. Felton, Winter, and, God help me, myself." Poirot lifted the paper to his nose. "The ink is recent. The typing, crisp. This was composed here, or very recently." Hastings asked, "Could Felton have written it?" Miss Marchmont responded, "I think so. He had a typewriter in his room. He brought it with him, one of those portable models." Poirot turned to her. "May I see it?" They ascended to the guest wing. Felton's room was still sealed, but, with the inspector's permission, Poirot and Hastings stepped inside. The typewriter sat on the desk, a sleek black Remington. Poirot pulled a blank sheet from the drawer and typed a single sentence. He held it beside the letter from Marchmont. The spacing matches. So does the misalignment in the letter E. Yes, this was his machine. Poirot stepped back and looked around the room. It was tidy, too tidy. The bed made, the suitcase closed, the desk drawers empty. Hastings noticed it too. He was packing. Or, Poirot said slowly, someone cleaned the room after the murder. Poirot opened the closet. The coat hangers held 3 suits. On the shelf above, a tin box caught his eye. He opened it. Inside were dozens of small index cards, each one labelled with a name, a date, a place. Hastings frowned. What are those? Poirot pulled one out and read aloud. Marchmont, E. Istanbul, 1946. French Café, courier intercepted. Another. Winter, A. Mandalay, 1942. Double-back signal failure, 3rd Brigade ambushed. Poirot's face grew dark. This is a ledger, Hastings, a map of suspicion. Felton was compiling a dossier of secrets, accusations, perhaps truths. He held up a final card. Willoughby, Monsieur Algiers, 1944. Identity unverified. Ariadne. Poirot's eyes widened. Ariadne! They returned to the sitting room, where Lady Margaret Willoughby was thumbing through an old volume of poetry. She looked up, her pale eyes weary. Ah, the great detective returns. Poirot sat gently. Lady Willoughby, I must ask, does the name Ariadne mean anything to you? Her breath caught, just for a moment. Then she smiled. Of course, Greek mythology. She helped Theseus navigate the labyrinth. Poirot tapped the index card, and yet Felton wrote your name beside it. Algiers, 1944. What was your role there? Willoughby set down her book. I worked for the Red Cross. At least that was the cover. In truth, I ferried messages between Allied agents and the local resistance. I was trained in codes. My handler gave me the code name, Ariadne. Poirot nodded. And Felton knew this. We met once, briefly. He did not know my real name. Then, why did he note it down? Her voice turned cool. Because he suspected everyone. Felton distrusted anyone who lived in shadows, even those on the same side. Poirot stood. Merci, madame. In the hallway, Hastings muttered, Felton built a web, and someone feared they were the spider he'd catch. Exactement, Poirot said, and now we know the study meeting was not spontaneous. Felton summoned his killer. Just then Inspector Cobb approached them with a puzzled look. We've just completed the ballistics test, he said. The bullet that killed Felton meant caliber, but none of the registered weapons in this house match it. Hastings blinked. So, where's the murder weapon? Exactly, Cobb said. We believe it was taken away after the crime. Poirot murmured, a gun, a message, a missing file. Then he turned abruptly. Hastings, we must examine the fireplace. Back in the study, Poirot crouched by the cold hearth and ran his fingers gently along the soot-streaked bricks. He paused, then pulled out a half-burnt corner of thick parchment. The words on it, barely visible, read, The traitor is among us. Poirot's face was grim. Felton was burning the evidence when he was killed. Someone silenced him seconds too soon. Hastings leaned closer, so the killer didn't get what they came for. Poirot stood slowly. No, mon ami, and that means they will try again tonight. Chapter 6. A whisper in the library twilight bled into the corridors of Birkwood Hall, turning its ancient walls into silent observers. The once warm mansion felt colder now, as if mourning the secrets hidden within its stones. Poirot stood near the library window, his reflection framed in the glass, like a man watching himself prepare for war. Someone is hunting the truth, he murmured almost to himself. Hastings, who had been reorganizing the index cards found in Felton's room, looked up. And you believe they'll strike again tonight? Poirot turned slowly. Oui, our murderer is not finished. Felton's death was not just a silencing, it was an interruption. The killer still fears exposure. If Felton hid something, perhaps a duplicate file, another clue, they will seek it out, and they will act with haste. He stepped away from the window and placed a card on the table. It read, Evelyn Marchmont, Cairo, 1941, cipher, mishandled, agent compromised. Poirot tapped the card thoughtfully. This file contains grave accusations. But, Hastings, remember, it may not be truth. It is Felton's perception, and Felton was not a man untouched by vengeance. The library door creaked open. It was Inspector Cobb. I've interviewed all the staff again. None saw anyone enter the study during the crucial half-hour. But the gardener, Mr. Lyle, recalled seeing someone cross the south lawn shortly before midnight, the night before the murder. Did he identify them? Poirot asked. Too dark. Just a silhouette. But he said they stopped at the hedge near the east wing, as if waiting or watching. Poirot's brow furrowed. There is no reason to be on that path unless one intended to avoid being seen. Curious. That evening, Birkwood Hall was subdued. Dinner was a tense affair. Polite chatter over roasted pheasant and carrots, while everyone's eyes watched. Each other instead of the food. Poirot observed them all. Lady Willoughby, sipping wine with a touch too much calm. Evelyn Marchmont, her hands folded tight in her lap. Colonel Winter, fidgeting with his fork, and young Michael Felton's cousin Lydia Trent, who had barely touched her plate. Halfway through the meal, Lydia stood abruptly. "I'm sorry. I feel unwell. May I be excused?" Lady Willoughby waved a dismissive hand. "Go on, dear." Lydia departed. Poirot's gaze lingered. She walked quickly, almost too quickly. Not a glance behind her. "She's hiding something," Hastings whispered. Poirot nodded faintly. "We must give her time." Later that night, Poirot, with Hastings close behind, crept silently through the corridor toward the east wing. Air was heavy, the kind that muffles footsteps and thoughts alike. "Do you really expect the murderer to make a move tonight?" Hastings asked, whispering. Poirot paused by the door to the small sitting room, adjacent to the old servant's stairwell. "No, I expect someone else to." He opened the door gently. Inside, Lydia Trent stood by the fireplace, holding something in her hands. A small leather-bound notebook. She spun around with a gasp. "Monsieur Poirot!" Poirot raised a calming hand. "Do not be alarmed, mademoiselle. You are not in danger from us." Her eyes darted toward the book. Poirot saw it clearly now. Embossed with initials, M.F., Michael Felton's? He asked softly. She hesitated, then nodded. "I found it behind the panel in the old hallway closet. He must have hidden it there. I didn't want to give it to the inspector. I don't know who to trust any more." Poirot extended his hand. "May I?" She hesitated only a moment before surrendering it. Poirot flipped through its pages, spidery handwriting, meticulous notes. Hastings leaned in. "It's a diary?" "Of sorts," Poirot said, "but also a codebook. This is what someone killed for." He turned to Lydia. "Why were you searching?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Because I know Michael didn't just keep records out of paranoia. He told me he was on to something. Something about a double agent who had resurfaced. He didn't name them, but he said it was someone powerful, someone no one would suspect." Poirot closed the book. "You were trying to finish what he started." She nodded. "And now I'm afraid I'll be next." Poirot gave her a firm look. "You must trust me. Stay in your room tonight. Lock the door, no matter what happens." Shortly after midnight, Poirot returned to the library, notebook in hand. He lit a single lamp and opened the volume again, searching for something buried deep within the coded entries. And then he found it, a page dated 3 days before the murder. In Felton's precise hand, have confirmed the identity of Perseus. Proof lies in the Naval Intercept Rangoon file. Agent at Birkwood. Need to confront them directly. No more shadows. Poirot whispered, "Perseus!" The alias struck a familiar chord. Something Hastings had mentioned in passing. No, someone had used it years ago. In an intercepted German communiqué. He had no more time to think. A soft creak outside the door. Poirot extinguished the lamp instantly and moved into the shadows near the fireplace. The door opened. A silhouette entered. Slow, silent. Poirot couldn't see their face, but the figure moved with purpose, heading straight to the desk drawer. It slid open soundlessly. Then Poirot flicked the light on. "Bonsoir," he said gently. The figure froze. It was Colonel Winter. His face, caught in the warm glow of the lamp, was a portrait of guilt. Poirot stepped forward. "You came for the notebook." Winter's mouth opened and closed. No, "Spare me," Poirot said. "You have secrets, Colonel. From Rangoon, from Mandalay. But this is not merely about shame, is it?" Winter's shoulders slumped. "You don't understand. Felton was dangerous. He wasn't searching for justice. He wanted control, leverage. He threatened to expose us all. Everyone who had ever operated in silence. He wanted blood." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "So you killed him?" Winter's eyes widened. "No, I confronted him. But he was alive when I left. He laughed at me, said I'd soon wish I'd confessed. I thought he was bluffing." Poirot studied him for a long moment. "Perhaps you are telling the truth. Perhaps not. But you are not the only one who feared what Felton knew." He pocketed the notebook. "Good night, Colonel." As Poirot returned to his room, the corridors of Birkwood Hall once again felt darker. The hunter was still among them, but now the bait had been taken. He closed his door softly and murmured, "Now the real game begins." Chapter 7. The ticking of the clocket was just past dawn, and the sky outside Birkwood Hall was a canvas of pale ash and violet. A storm had passed in the night, washing the air clean, but inside the great estate, tension clung like damp mist to the velvet drapes and polished stair rails. Somewhere, in the deep silence of early morning, a clock chimed 6. Poirot sat upright in his armchair, fully dressed, hands steepled beneath his chin. He had not slept. The black notebook, Felton's final legacy, rested on the desk beside him. Its coded entries, scratched in tiny, deliberate script, revealed more than whispers of betrayal. They revealed a pattern Poirot had begun to follow. "Perseus," he whispered again, tasting the word. "The code name of a traitor from long ago, and now resurrected." There was a knock at the door. Hastings entered, still tying his cravat. "Up already?" he asked. Poirot smiled faintly. "My dear Hastings, in affairs of espionage and murder, one must not allow himself the luxury of rest." He gestured to the notebook. "Felton left breadcrumbs, mon ami, and last night our Colonel Winter tried to brush them away." "You still don't believe he's the killer?" "Ah, I believe him guilty. Of fear, of silence, perhaps of cowardice, but not of murder. No, the hand that killed Felton is more cunning, more desperate. He rose, his shoes gleaming in the morning light. Come, it is time we paid a visit to Lady Willoughby's private collection. The upper west wing of Birkwood Hall had been Lady Willoughby's domain for decades. Her personal salon was more museum than sitting room, lined with antique display cases, war memorabilia from her late husband's days as a general, and curio cabinets locked with brass keys. She greeted Poirot and Hastings in her silk dressing-gown, seated beneath a portrait of her husband. A cup of black tea rested beside her. "You're up early, monsieur." "Forgive the intrusion, Lady Willoughby," Poirot said with a slight bow. "I have questions about the Rangoon file." Her eyes flicked ever so slightly. "You know of it?" "I do. It was mentioned in Michael Felton's notes, and I believe it is the missing piece in understanding why he was killed." She tapped her long nails against the porcelain teacup. "You understand the implications of what you're suggesting, monsieur? That someone here betrayed their country during the war?" "Oui. But more than that, they continued to act. Felton uncovered them. He paid for that with his life." Lady Willoughby stood slowly. She walked to a tall glass cabinet, drew a key from her chain, and opened it. From behind a row of medals and old dispatches, she withdrew a folder. "Ain't you?" "I kept this safe," she said, "not out of conspiracy, but shame. This came into my possession after a friend, an old code-breaker, passed away. He'd always suspected a double agent, but never confirmed it. This was his last note to me." She handed Poirot a single page. The writing was spidery, faded. Code, Perseus. Confirmed contact with Moscow, 1943. Identity unknown. Maker be embedded in diplomatic circles. Poirot nodded slowly. "And Felton, through his intelligence contacts, likely discovered more. Enough to trace the agent to Birkwood." "Do you suspect one of us?" Lady Willoughby asked sharply. "I suspect someone close, someone who feared exposure, and who had reason to silence Felton permanently." Later that morning, Poirot gathered all the guests in the drawing-room. Hastings, always curious about his friend's dramatic timing, leaned toward him. "Is it time for the reveal?" "No, not yet," Poirot replied. "This is merely an observation of pressure." Lady Willoughby, Evelyn Marchmont, Colonel Winter, Lydia Trent, and the reclusive Lord Whitcomb were present. Poirot walked the room as he spoke. "I have learned that Mr. Felton was investigating a spy, an agent from the Second World War who was never unmasked. A man, or perhaps a woman, who operated under the code name Perseus. I believe Mr. Felton believed this person to be among you." A ripple of discomfort ran through the room. Colonel Winter folded his arms. "This is ridiculous. That war is long over." "Is it?" Poirot asked gently. "Not to the dead." He turned to Lydia. "You found Felton's notebook, yet you did not come to me at once. Why?" Lydia flushed. "I was afraid. I didn't know who to trust. Michael, he didn't talk to anyone but me." "And did he name the traitor?" She hesitated. "No, just the code name, Perseus. He said he was close." Poirot nodded. "And now," he said, addressing them all, "the question is this. Who was close to Felton? Who had the most to lose if he succeeded in exposing the truth. Before anyone could respond, a loud crash echoed from upstairs. They rushed into the hallway, only to find Inspector Cobb sprinting from the east wing. "Lord Whitcomb's room!" he shouted. "He's dead!" In Lord Whitcomb's suite, a small crowd gathered. The man lay slumped at his desk, eyes glassy, skin pale. Poirot examined the teacup beside him. "Poison," he said softly. "Likely cyanide. Instantaneous." Hastings whispered, "Another victim?" Poirot frowned. "Or another silencing." Lady Willoughby entered, her face unreadable. "What does this mean?" Poirot turned to her. "It means our murderer is accelerating. Lord Whitcomb must have known something, perhaps enough to be dangerous." He stepped away, eyes on the hallway. "And I believe the killer is watching us even now." Chapter 8. The secret within the silent Birkwood Hall had grown quieter than death. The grand estate, once echoing with footsteps and murmurs of old money and polite suspicion, now held its breath. 2 lives had ended in swift succession. Michael Felton, the spy with too many secrets, and Lord Whitcomb, the silent man with a decaying past. The storm outside had returned with vengeance. Rain lashed against the windows, and thunder boomed in the distance like the slow beat of a war drum. Inside, Hercule Poirot sat in solitude, reflecting upon the broken pieces of the past few days. His mind, however, was not storm-tossed. It was crystalline. The time for observation had passed. Now he would begin to act. Poirot requested a private meeting with Inspector Cobb and Captain Hastings in the small conservatory attached to the eastern side of the manor. The glass ceiling let in streaks of grey light filtered through rain. Potted ferns surrounded them, giving the room a strange, enclosed calm. Poirot began with a question. "Mon cher Cobb, tell me, was Lord Whitcomb under surveillance after Felton's death?" Cobb looked uneasy. "Not formally. He'd hardly left his room, seemed barely aware of what was happening. And yet he was killed, poisoned in his tea, much like an old-school execution." Poirot leaned forward. He did not discover the identity of Perseus, but he remembered something, enough to die for. Hastings shifted in his chair. "And you think the killer is still here?" Poirot gave a tight smile. "Not think, my friend, I know." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "We must bait the hook." Later that afternoon, Poirot called for Evelyn Marchmont in the drawing-room. She arrived precisely on time, draped in a dove-grey coat with silver buttons, her hair styled with military precision. She did not sit. "Is this about Lord Whitcomb?" she asked, standing stiffly. "In part," Poirot replied. "Tell me, mademoiselle, do you recall your work in the diplomatic office during the war?" She said nothing. "You were never directly in the field, were you? Yet you had high-level access. Codes, schedules, embassy lists." Her expression faltered, if only slightly. "You and Felton had history, professional at first, and then, perhaps, something more." Her jaw tightened. "He was reckless." "He was hunting a ghost," Poirot said, "and he found it." She turned to the fireplace. "He thought everyone had something to hide." He was right. She said nothing, only turned back to him, with eyes like flint. Poirot's voice softened. Evelyn, Felton trusted you. He gave you the notebook. Why did you burn the original?" Her breath caught, but only for a moment. "Because it would have destroyed people. Good people." Poirot stood. "Including you?" Silence. "Bon," Poirot said. "I believe that is all for now." She left without another word. That evening, Poirot returned to Lady Willoughby. Inchye had not left her rooms since Lord Whitcomb's death, choosing to sit beneath her husband's portrait, nursing the same cup of tea. "You knew Whitcomb long before this gathering," Poirot said, standing by the doorway. "He was my husband's aide during Burma," she replied. "A loyal man, but troubled." "Did he ever speak of guilt?" She hesitated. "He confessed something once, after too much whiskey. He said there was a file he'd destroyed, a code book he burned when he realized what it contained." Poirot's brow furrowed. "A code book?" She nodded. "Names, real names of agents, including one who shared British intelligence with the Russians." "And did he mention the code name?" "Perseus," she whispered. Poirot's voice dropped. "Thank you, madame. You've been most helpful." He left with urgency burning in his steps. Night fell again. Poirot summoned everyone to the Grand Library, the largest room in Birkwood Hall. They entered one by one, drawn by the weight of expectation and dread. Hastings stood quietly to the Tourdieu side, watching the flicker of candlelight play across solemn faces. Lady Willoughby, Colonel Winter, Evelyn Marchmont, Lydia Trent, Inspector, Cobb. Poirot entered last, walking with calm dignity, his hands behind his back. "We have waited long enough," he said. "The murderer walks among us, and tonight we shall unmask them." No one spoke. Poirot circled the room slowly, pausing to study each guest. Michael Felton came to Birkwood not for pleasure, but for duty. He believed that one of you was connected to a long-dead espionage case. The case of Perseus, a British traitor, a master manipulator who never faced justice. Poirot turned to the Colonel. "You, Colonel Winter, had a motive. Your military reputation could have been stained by Felton's discoveries. To suggest I'm a traitor." Winter started. Poirot raised a hand. "I did not say that, but you knew something. You had your suspicions. You were too frightened to voice them." Next, he turned to Lydia. "You found the notebook. You kept silent. You lied to me, mademoiselle." "I was scared." Poirot nodded. "And yet you read it. You knew the code name, and you knew it connected to someone here." Now Poirot faced Evelyn Marchmont. "You, madame, worked in intelligence. You had access to the files. You saw the name Perseus, and you recognized it." She did not respond. Poirot continued. "Felton gave you the original notebook, perhaps in trust, perhaps as a test. You burned it, but not to protect the innocent. No, because you were in it." Gasps filled the room. Poirot's voice dropped, barely above a whisper. "Evelyn Marchmont, you are Perseus." The silence shattered into chaos. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her poise never faltering. "You're insane." Poirot shook his head slowly. "No. You were young, brilliant, disillusioned. The perfect target for recruitment. You supplied information, codes, signals, contacts. Felton traced it. The cipher matched your transmissions." Inspector Cobb stepped forward. You poisoned Whitcomb." "He found an old file," Poirot said, "a letter of confession meant for his superior. He intended to give it to me, but he spoke to Evelyn first. Evelyn's facade cracked. He was weak." "You killed Felton too," Poirot said. "Trusted you. You used that trust to silence him." Still she stood her ground. "I saved lives," she said coldly. "No one understands what we faced. I served my ideals." Poirot's voice hardened. "You served yourself." Inspector Cobb signalled 2 constables, who stepped forward to take her away. She did not resist. She merely turned to Poirot with a final look, cold, distant, unrepentant. "Always admired you," she said. "Your little grey cells. Shame you never used them during the war." And then she was gone. Chapter 9. The final pieces of the puzzle. The clock in the hallway ticked relentlessly. Its ticking was sharp, like the sound of truth unfurling. Outside the rain had ceased, but the sky remained heavy, a curtain of grey that smothered the estate in a suffocating silence. The echoes of Evelyn Marchmont's arrest reverberated throughout Birkwood Hall, but there was no true sense of relief, only a deep, gnawing tension that gnawed at Poirot's mind. The case, while concluded on the surface, had only unfolded more layers. Evelyn's confession that she had been Perseus, the elusive British agent who had sold secrets to the Russians, had shattered the final illusion. Yet something still tugged at Poirot's attention. It wasn't the crime itself that troubled him. It was the reasoning behind it. There was something more, something left unsaid, something about the nature of the betrayal, the way it had been so meticulously orchestrated, that didn't sit right. Poirot stood by the grand window, his back to the rest of the room, where Hastings and Inspector Cobb were speaking in hushed tones. They had long since given up asking him for answers before he was ready to provide them. They knew better now. Poirot was a man who required silence, reflection. When the time came, he would speak, and so he did. Turning from the window, Poirot took a seat by the fire. The warmth of the flames did little to ease the chill that had settled deep within him. It was time for a final confrontation, not with Evelyn Marchmont. She was already in custody, her future sealed, but with the ghosts of the past that had followed her through her treachery. Hastings was the first to approach. His brow was furrowed, his face a mixture of confusion and frustration. "Poirot," he began, "I know we've solved the case. I know we've caught her, but it doesn't feel finished." Poirot looked up at his old friend, his face serene, yet his eyes betrayed a storm of thought. "You are right, Hastings," Poirot said, his voice calm yet piercing. "It does not feel finished. There is one more question we must ask." Hastings blinked, his curiosity piqued. "What question?" Poirot leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Why? Why?" Hastings repeated, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Monsieur, did Evelyn Marchmont betray her country? Why did she continue working as Perseus after the war ended, after the Russian agents had been uncovered, after the Cold War had begun? The question is not merely about her actions. It is about her motive, her purpose. There was more to her than just a spy. She was a woman of conviction, of ideals, and those ideals, I believe, were the true reason for her betrayal." Hastings considered Poirot's words carefully. So, you think it wasn't about money or power? Poirot shook his head. No, Hastings. It was never about those things. She betrayed her own country for something far more dangerous. Her belief in a greater cause, a cause that clouded her judgment and twisted her loyalty. I see, Hastings said slowly, finally grasping Poirot's reasoning. You think she saw herself as a patriot, even when she was working against Britain? Poirot nodded. Precisely. She believed in her mind that her actions were justified. She thought that by serving Russia, she was protecting her country from a future she feared. The betrayal was not one of greed or desire. It was a betrayal born of misguided idealism. That, my friend, is what makes it so insidious. The room fell silent as Poirot's words sank in. There was an undeniable weight to them, an uncomfortable truth about the nature of espionage and loyalty. The world, as Poirot had learned time and again, was rarely black and white. In this case, it was painted in shades of grey. Inspector Cobb, who had been listening quietly from his position near the door, cleared his throat. You think there's more to the story, don't you, Poirot? Poirot's gaze flickered toward the inspector. Indeed, Cobb. There is always more to the story, isn't there? Even after the killer is caught, even after the last confession is made, the truth has a way of lingering in the shadows. I suspect Evelyn Marchmont believed she was playing a far grander game, and in that game she was not alone. A tense silence followed his statement. Cobb's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Poirot stood, his movements precise and deliberate. I believe there is one more player in this grand scheme. Someone who is still out there. Someone who was manipulating Evelyn from the very beginning. Who? Hastings asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Poirot met his friend's gaze with quiet determination. The person who truly controlled Evelyn Marchmont was not some foreign power or shadowy figure. No, it was someone much closer to home, someone who knew her, someone who played her like a puppet. Cobb's face turned pale. You're saying someone in this very house, someone we've overlooked, has been pulling the strings all along? Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes darkening. Yes, Inspector, the strings were pulled from within these walls. The storm outside had passed, but the ominous clouds remained, hanging over Birkwood Hall like a dark omen. Poirot's mind was already racing through the possibilities. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they created was far more complex than he had anticipated. The first hint of a conspiracy had come when Poirot uncovered the coded messages in Michael Felton's notebook. He had followed those breadcrumbs, leading him to Evelyn Marchmont. But Evelyn had been a pawn, not the mastermind. She had been used, played by someone who had been hiding in plain sight. The question was, who? Poirot's thoughts turned to the other inhabitants of Birkwood Hall. Colonel Winter was a man of stature, but his motives had been rooted in fear, not ambition. Lady Willoughby, while deeply connected to the estate, seemed too mired in the past to be involved in something so covert. Lydia Trent had her own secrets, but she had been too distracted by the chaos of the investigation to be the mastermind. That left only one other possibility. Poirot turned sharply to Cobb and Hastings. It is time we pay a visit to the one person who has remained above suspicion. The one person whose true role has yet to be revealed. Who? Hastings asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. Poirot's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Lord Whitcomb!" Cobb blinked. "Whitcomb, but he's dead. Poisoned." "Ah," Poirot replied, "but that was the point, mon ami. His death was not an unfortunate accident. It was the final move in a game he had been playing for years." Hastings looked stunned. "You mean to say that Lord Whitcomb wasn't just a victim? He was part of the conspiracy?" Poirot nodded. "Indeed, he had been playing both sides of the game. An intelligence officer during the war, but also a man with connections to those who sought to undermine the British government. Whitcomb's death was staged. He was never the innocent man everyone believed him to be." "But why?" Cobb asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "Why would he do it?" Poirot's gaze was distant as he spoke. Lord Whitcomb was a man of ambition. He had grown disillusioned with Britain's role in the world, and he sought to realign his loyalties. He worked with Evelyn, guiding her actions, manipulating her into believing that she was serving a higher cause. And when it became clear that she had outlived her usefulness, Whitcomb orchestrated his own death, making it look like a poisoning to throw us off the trail. Hastings took a step forward. "So he was the true mastermind all along?" Poirot nodded. "Exactly. Lord Whitcomb's death was a calculated move, a way of removing himself from the equation without ever truly being caught. He manipulated Evelyn, used her, and then disposed of her when he no longer needed her. And now his involvement in this web of deceit has finally come to light." As Poirot stood in the middle of the Grand Library, his mind raced through the events that had led them here. The pieces of the puzzle were now fully in place. Evelyn Marchmont had been a pawn in a much larger game, one orchestrated by Lord Whitcomb. His manipulation, his lies, had cost lives, including his own. Poirot looked over at Hastings and Cobb, both of whom were still processing the weight of the revelations. They had been chasing shadows, unaware of the true puppeteer lurking in the background. But now the mystery was solved. And yet Poirot couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to learn, more to uncover, for in the world of espionage, truth was always a fleeting thing, and every answer raised more questions. Chapter 10. The Final Curtain. The moon hung heavy and low in the night sky, casting its pale light over the grounds of Birkwood Hall, where the remnants of the storm left only the scent of damp earth in the air. It was a night of reflection, one where secrets were finally exposed, and the weight of truth pressed down upon those who had been part of the twisted game. Hercule Poirot sat alone in the study, his sharp mind churning over the final pieces of the puzzle. He had uncovered the full extent of Lord Whitcomb's treachery, and yet something about it left him uneasy. The game was over, the criminal unmasked, but Poirot could not dismiss the lingering sense of unfinished business that gnawed at his insides. The door creaked open, and Hastings stepped into the room. The tall, solid frame of his friend, his ever-present companion, seemed somewhat diminished tonight. Poirot could see the strain in Hastings's eyes, the way the case had weighed on him, and in a way it had affected Poirot as well. "Oh, Poirot," Hastings began, his voice heavy with an unspoken question. "What happens now?" Poirot turned his gaze from the fire, his piercing eyes locking onto Hastings. He gestured for him to take a seat across from him, the firelight flickering across Poirot's face as he spoke. "It is over, mon ami," Poirot said, his voice calm, but laced with an undercurrent of something deeper. "The case has been solved. The web of lies has been unravelled. Lord Whitcomb, the mastermind behind it all, has been exposed for the treacherous man he was. Evelyn Marchmont, the spy, is in custody." "But still, Poirot," Hastings said, leaning forward, his voice desperate. "There's a feeling in the air. I can't shake it. It's as if we're all walking away from this, but there's something we're not seeing, something that's been left behind. You've uncovered all the facts, but have we really understood everything?" Poirot regarded his friend with a silent intensity. He could feel Hastings's unease, but he also knew that this was a question that had lingered in his own mind. There was something about the case that didn't quite sit right. The pieces were all in place, yes, but there was a sense of falseness to it all, an unsettling gap between the truth they had uncovered and the reality they had to accept. Poirot sat back in his chair, his fingers steepling together, a familiar gesture that meant his mind was working, calculating, searching for the missing element. "You are right, Hastings," Poirot said slowly, his gaze shifting to the darkened window. "There is something more, something we have missed. The true nature of Lord Whitcomb's death. It was not as it appeared." Hastings looked confused. "But you said yourself that his death was staged, poisoned to throw us off the scent." It seemed to fit perfectly with his manipulation of Evelyn. Poirot nodded, but there was a certain coldness in his eyes now, a sharpness that cut through the air, like a knife. "Yes, that is true. But in my experience, nothing is ever quite as simple as it seems. If you look closely, Hastings, you will see that Lord Whitcomb's plan, his final act, was not about escaping the consequences of his actions. It was about something far more subtle, something more calculated." "Calculated? In death?" Hastings repeated, unable to follow Poirot's reasoning. "What do you mean?" Poirot's lips curled into a thin smile. "I believe Lord Whitcomb staged his death not just to mislead us, but to ensure that the story would be told in the exact way he wanted it to be. You see, mon ami, the only way a man like Whitcomb could truly escape the consequences of his actions was not by running from the law, but by controlling the narrative. He didn't care about his own life. What he cared about was the legacy he left behind." Hastings stared at Poirot, trying to understand, but the complexity of his friend's thoughts often seemed like a puzzle of its own. He knew better than to ask questions that might divert Poirot's train of thought, so he remained silent, waiting for the full explanation. Poirot continued. "Whitcomb knew that, should we find him, he would be tried for his treason. He would be disgraced, his reputation destroyed. So, instead of running, he used his final moments to manipulate the situation. By orchestrating his own death, he ensured that the focus would never be on his betrayal, but on his supposed sacrifice. He planted the seed of his heroism, the myth of the man who had been wronged by the very government he served, and in doing so, he clouded the truth." Hastings shook his head, as if trying to follow the thread of Poirot's logic. "So, you believe he wanted us to think he was a martyr? That he wanted to be remembered as a hero, not a villain?" Poirot nodded, his face grave. Exactly. It is a trick that many have played, but it is a dangerous one. And it worked. The investigation was swayed by his death, by the belief that he had been a victim. In truth, the man who died was not a martyr, but a traitor who had seen his own end as the perfect way to complete his grand design. But why? Hastings asked, the confusion still evident in his voice. Why go through all this deception if he was already working against Britain? Why not simply fade into obscurity? Poirot's eyes gleamed with the sharp insight that only he possessed. Because, Hastings, for a man like Whitcomb, there is no such thing as obscurity. He was not content to be forgotten. He wanted to be remembered, not as the villain, but as the misunderstood hero. He wanted to control the legacy that would remain after his death, and through his manipulations he ensured that no one would ever know the full truth of his actions. The words hung in the air, and for a moment there was only the crackling of the fire to break the silence. Poirot's mind worked tirelessly, trying to find the final clue, the one piece that would fully explain Whitcomb's final scheme. Then it struck him, the one detail he had overlooked, the one thing that had slipped past his careful observation. "Of course," Poirot said, suddenly standing. "Hastings, we have missed something crucial. The final act of Whitcomb's deception was not merely his death. It was the role of his wife, Lady Whitcomb." Hastings looked up, his eyes widening. "Lady Whitcomb, what do you mean?" Poirot turned toward him, his expression intense. "Lady Whitcomb was in on it. She knew everything. She played her part in the grand design, supporting her husband's plan, helping him stage his death, and ensuring that the narrative of heroism was perpetuated. She may have been the one to poison him, just as the letter in her handwriting indicated, but she was also complicit in his final act." Hastings blinked, his mind racing. But why would she help him? She must have known the consequences if the truth ever came out. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Ah, but that is where it becomes even more complex. Lady Whitcomb was not just his wife. She was his partner in this scheme. She was not merely supporting him out of love or loyalty. She believed in his cause just as much as he did. She saw herself as the protector of his legacy, the one who would ensure that his name would be remembered as that of a man who had been misunderstood, a man who had sacrificed everything for his beliefs. Hastings shook his head. "That's incredible. So, all this time she was part of the deception?" Poirot nodded. "Exactly. And now we must confront her with the truth, for she is the last piece in this grand puzzle." The night had grown colder, and the air outside seemed to thicken with anticipation. Poirot, Hastings, and Cobb stood together outside the estate's drawing-room, where Lady Whitcomb waited, unaware of the storm about to break. Poirot had already set the stage for the final confrontation. They would confront Lady Whitcomb with the full extent of her role in her husband's deception, and in doing so, they would expose the final layer of the mystery. The door opened, and Lady Whitcomb stepped into the room, her posture perfect, her face a mask of calm composure. But Poirot saw the flicker in her eyes, the faintest crack in the facade. "Madame," Poirot said, his voice smooth but cutting, through the tension like a blade, We have come to the final stage of our investigation. Lady Whitcomb's eyes narrowed, but she did not flinch. I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot smiled, a cold, calculating smile. Ah, madam, you are very skilled at playing the role of the dutiful wife. But no one can hide the truth forever. Your husband's legacy, his death, was not the end of the story. It was merely the beginning. And now the full truth must come to light. The final curtain was drawn. The pieces of the puzzle fit together. The case was closed, but the echoes of the past would remain long after Poirot's departure. The detective's work was done. The truth had been revealed. And so, with his customary bow and a final knowing smile, Poirot left Birkwood Hall, knowing that the world would go on, and that even the greatest of mysteries, like all things, would one day fade into history. Chapter 11. The Echoes of Justice. The morning after the storm had passed, the sun rose slowly over Birkwood Hall, casting a golden light across the dew-covered grounds. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine trees lingering in the breeze. It was a morning of quiet reflection, a morning when the world outside seemed to move forward as if the events of the past week had not even occurred. Yet inside the grand estate, the echoes of the past reverberated still. Hercule Poirot sat alone in the study, his mind working as tirelessly as ever. His presence was as poised and precise as always, his sharp eyes fixed on the few remaining pieces of the puzzle that had occupied him for days. The case was solved, the culprit unmasked, but Poirot could never truly rest until he had extracted every last detail, until he had pieced together the narrative of the crime in its entirety. Behind him, the door creaked open, and Captain Hastings entered, his face as weary as it had been the night before. He had not rested since their final confrontation with Lady Whitcomb. The tension between the two men was palpable, but it had not dampened the bond they shared. They had faced many mysteries together, but this one, with its layers of deception, had left them both altered. "Poirot," Hastings began, his voice tinged with an undercurrent of unresolved thoughts. "I've been thinking about Whitcomb, about the entire case." Poirot glanced over his shoulder, his sharp eyes catching Hastings' gaze with a quiet intensity. "Yes, Hastings, I too have been thinking. There is something we must address before we leave Birkwood Hall, something we cannot simply ignore." Hastings frowned, stepping further into the room. "What do you mean?" Poirot gestured to the chair across from him, inviting Hastings to sit. As he did so, Poirot leaned forward, his hands resting neatly on the polished surface of the desk. "The case is not finished, mon ami. It is true that the killer has been revealed and arrested, but there is something in the nature of Lord Whitcomb's final act, something we have yet to understand fully." Hastings sat, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean? I thought we had uncovered everything, the manipulation, the deception, Lady Whitcomb's complicity." Poirot nodded, but his eyes darkened with a subtle, unspoken realization. "Ah, but you see, Hastings, the web spun by Whitcomb and his wife was more intricate than we realized. I believe they were not just trying to control the narrative of their lives, but they were also attempting to rewrite the truth itself. They wanted to manipulate the future, not just their past." Hastings leaned back, contemplating this. You mean they wanted to make sure their story was the one that would be told? Exactly, Poirot replied, his tone calm, yet charged with the gravity of his insight. They understood that the truth would be lost in time. History, as we know, is written by those who survive. Lord Whitcomb and his wife knew that their actions would be examined in the years to come. They crafted a story that would endure, even after they were gone. Hastings' expression shifted from confusion to realization. But they did more than just deceive us, Poirot. They made sure that even when the truth came to light, it would be questioned, distorted. They buried the truth so deep that it would be nearly impossible to find. Poirot's lips curled into a tight smile. And that is why I cannot leave Birkwood Hall without addressing the consequences of their actions. We must ensure that their story does not become the version the world remembers. Hastings nodded. But how? The case is solved. Lady Whitcomb is in custody, and the truth is out there. Ah, Poirot said, tapping his fingers together thoughtfully. The truth, yes, but we must ensure that it is not overshadowed by the shadow of the lie. That is where our work truly begins, mon ami. The two men made their way to the grand dining room, where the family of Lord Whitcomb had gathered, as they had been summoned earlier in the morning. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Evelyn Marchmont, still shaken by the events of the previous days, sat quietly at the far end of the room. Her pale face, lined with the strain of a woman who had been caught in a web of deceit far larger than she had anticipated, was an image of quiet despair. Yet Poirot could detect a flicker of resolve in her eyes. She had been part of the deception, yes, but she had not been the mastermind. Lady Whitcomb, however, remained stoic. The last few days had taken their toll on her, but she held herself with the dignity of a woman who had once been at the height of society, a woman who was no longer in control, but who could still command the respect of others. The room fell silent as Poirot and Hastings entered. Poirot's gaze swept over the gathered group, the family, the servants, the few remaining guests who had yet to leave Birkwood Hall. He knew that, for all their bravado, each one of them was implicated in some way. Each had been part of a larger scheme, some more actively than others, but all were guilty of allowing the narrative to unfold the way it had. Poirot stepped to the front of the room, his back straight and his posture immaculate. He waited a moment before speaking, his voice carrying a quiet authority. We are here today, not simply to resolve the case of Lord Whitcomb's death, Poirot said, his eyes scanning the room, resting briefly on each individual. No, we are here to address the true nature of the events that transpired. You see, my friends, though you may have thought the game was over, there is more to this story. The truth is not merely about murder and deception. It is about power. It is about control. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle in the room. Lord Whitcomb and his wife, they understood this power, Poirot continued. They understood that the greatest crime they could commit was not murder, but manipulation. They manipulated not only those around them, but also history itself. Way the world would remember them, and that, mon ami, is the greatest deception of all. The room was deathly silent. Poirot's words had struck a nerve with everyone present. They knew that their own actions, however passive or active, had contributed to the distortion of the truth. The tension in the air was palpable, each person keenly aware of the gravity of their participation. Hastings stood beside Poirot, his face solemn. The story you told the world, the version you have allowed to circulate, was one of sacrifice and betrayal. But the truth, the real truth, is far darker, and it is that truth we must face. Lady Whitcomb looked up at Poirot, her eyes narrowing, with defiance. "You believe you know the truth, Poirot, but you are mistaken. My husband's legacy is beyond your reach. You cannot erase the history he crafted." Poirot's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. "Ah, madame, I do not seek to erase history. I only wish to correct it. The truth cannot be controlled by those who wish to rewrite it. And the truth, as it stands, is this. Lord Whitcomb was not a martyr, but a traitor. He betrayed the very ideals he claimed to protect. He and you, madam, plotted to ensure your version of the past would be the one remembered, but it will not be." For the first time, Lady Whitcomb faltered. Her composure slipped, if only for a moment. But Poirot could see it, the crack in her façade. She knew, deep down, that the narrative they had crafted could not hold. It was as fragile as the myth it sought to create. Poirot turned to the others in the room. "And you," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "You allowed this to happen. You, the servants, the guests, the family. Each of you played a part in perpetuating the lie. It is time for the truth to be known, for the record to be set straight." Hastings spoke next, his voice resolute. "The facts are clear. Lord Whitcomb was a man driven by selfishness and greed, not honour. His death was not a sacrifice, but a carefully crafted scheme to manipulate public opinion and control the story. He did not die for his beliefs. He died because his own deceit had caught up with him." Poirot paused, allowing the words to sink in before continuing. "The time for lies is over. The truth is out, and now it must be told to the world. Lord Whitcomb and his wife may have controlled the narrative for a time, but that control ends here, today." The silence that followed was thick with tension, but Poirot knew, as always, that this was the only way to restore balance to the story, to ensure that history would not be skewed by those who sought to manipulate it. Finally, Lady Whitcomb stood, her posture trembling for the first time. She met Poirot's gaze with a mixture of defiance, shared purpose undiminished by the shadows of the past. Chapter 12. The Final Pieces. The following days at Birkwood Hall felt strangely empty, despite the presence of those who had come to witness the resolution of the tragic affair. The house itself, once a monument to grandeur and opulence, now seemed like a mausoleum. The echoes of deceit and betrayal had left their mark, and even the sun, now shining brightly over the sprawling estate, could not lift the pervasive sense of doom that hung in the air. Hercule Poirot sat in his room, a modest but comfortable space overlooking the well-kept gardens. His thoughts, though calm on the surface, churned beneath. His mind never stopped, working, never ceased its relentless pursuit of order in the midst of chaos. He had brought justice to the crime of Lord Whitcomb's death, and yet something gnawed at him. There was more, something that had not quite been revealed, something subtle, something elusive, but not yet understood. As Poirot sat by the window, gazing out at the grounds, Captain Hastings entered the room. He had been busy with various tasks around the estate, making sure the arrangements were in place for the return of the remaining guests to London. But, as always, he made his way to Poirot's side whenever the two needed to discuss the case. "Poirot," Hastings began, settling into a chair across from him. "What is it? What's bothering you?" Poirot didn't immediately respond. He simply continued to gaze out at the gardens, lost in thought. After a moment, he sighed and turned to his friend, his sharp eyes piercing through the quiet. "Hastings," Poirot said softly, "we have uncovered the truth about Lord Whitcomb's death. Yes, we know who was responsible, and we know the motivations behind the crime. But something is still not sitting right with me. There is a final piece, a small but important piece, that has not yet fallen into place." Hastings raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean? You're saying there's more to this than we've uncovered?" Poirot nodded, his expression as resolute as ever. There is a detail, a nuance, a part of the puzzle that we missed. It may seem insignificant on the surface, but it is critical to understanding the full scope of this affair." Hastings leaned forward. "I don't follow, Poirot. What could we have missed? Lady Whitcomb is in custody. The murder weapon was found. The motive was clear. What's left?" Poirot steepled his fingers, his mind spinning through the events of the past few days, mentally retracing each step, each conversation, each movement. The pieces of the puzzle were all there, but there was something hidden just beneath the surface, something he had overlooked until now. "Consider this, Hastings," Poirot said slowly. "When Lady Whitcomb orchestrated her husband's death, it was not merely for money or revenge. No, there was something else. She knew the consequences of her actions, and she took steps to make sure the truth would never be fully known. But why? Why go to such lengths to control the narrative of her life and her husband's death?" Hastings blinked, a slow realization dawning on him. "You're saying it wasn't just about saving herself from the scandal? There's something more? Something deeper?" Poirot nodded gravely. "Exactly. Lady Whitcomb's motives were not purely selfish. She was trying to protect something far more valuable than her reputation or her wealth." "But what?" The two men sat in silence, the weight of Poirot's words hanging in the air. After a long pause, Hastings spoke again, his voice tentative. "Do you think there's someone else involved? Another person who's been pulling the strings behind the scenes?" Poirot's eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a small smile. "Ah, Hastings, you are beginning to understand. It is possible, n'est-ce pas? But who would it be? That is the question." The investigation took a new turn the following day. Poirot had requested the return of the estate's original staff to the Hall, some of whom had been dismissed or sent away during the height of the investigation. Hastings and Poirot had made arrangements to speak with them privately. As they sat together in the grand dining room, the former servants of the Whitcomb household filed in one by one. There was Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, a stern woman in her late 50s, her face etched with years of service to the Whitcomb family. Next was Mr. Hargrove, the butler, a man of quiet dignity who had been in the family's employ for decades. Following them were the kitchen staff, the footmen and the maids, All of them had witnessed something during the events surrounding Lord Whitcomb's death. They had been in the house when the tragedy occurred, and they held pieces of the story that could shed light on Poirot's lingering questions. Poirot's interrogation was careful, methodical. He approached each individual with the same precise questioning, never showing any sign of frustration or impatience. He asked about the night of the murder, about the conversations they had overheard, the actions they had seen. But most of all, he asked about the relationship between Lady Whitcomb and the other members of the household. Was there anyone who had behaved strangely? Any odd behaviour that could explain the circumstances? Mrs. Blackwood's answer came first. Lady Whitcomb, sir, was always a woman of great control, but on the night of Lord Whitcomb's death she seemed different. Her eyes were distant, as if she was somewhere else entirely. I did not question her. She is my employer, after all. But it was as though she were no longer the woman we all knew. Mr. Hargrove, the butler, gave a similar report. She was on edge, sir. There was a nervousness about her. She had been uncharacteristically short with me, even when I asked if she needed anything. That was the night, just before dinner, when she instructed me to lock the study door behind her. She had a look in her eyes that I have never seen before. Poirot nodded as he listened to the testimonies, his mind working through the pieces. Something about Lady Whitcomb's behaviour seemed off, something more than mere guilt. It was a pattern that was emerging, a pattern of control, of manipulation, but with a deeper purpose than mere self-preservation. The interviews continued for hours, but it wasn't until the last servant, a young maid named Clara, spoke up that Poirot's suspicions were confirmed. "I didn't see much, sir," Clara said quietly, her hands twisting in her lap nervously. "But I overheard a conversation. It was in the hallway outside the study, just before Lady Whitcomb went in. She was speaking to someone. I didn't see the person, but I heard her words. She said something about ensuring it all falls into place. I don't know what she meant, sir, but it sounded like she was speaking to someone she trusted, someone she knew well." Poirot's pulse quickened. This was the lead he had been waiting for, the final thread in the intricate web of deceit. He looked at Clara with a piercing gaze. "Did you hear the name of this person? Who was she speaking to?" Clara shook her head. "I didn't catch the name, sir. But she was speaking quietly, like she didn't want anyone to hear. All I know is that it was a man, and they were speaking in code, as though they knew exactly what needed to be done." Poirot stood, his mind racing. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have provided me with the clue I needed." The investigation had now taken a sharp turn. Poirot's mind was working rapidly, putting together all the pieces. Lady Whitcomb had not acted alone. He was sure of it now. Someone else had been involved, someone who had been orchestrating the events from the shadows. This person was the true mastermind behind the plot. The question now was, who? Poirot wasted no time in acting on this new lead. He instructed Hastings to gather all the remaining evidence, to interview the guests once again, and to focus on the smallest of details. They had to track down the elusive figure who had spoken with Lady Whitcomb in that quiet hallway. Poirot knew that they were close, very close, to uncovering the final truth. But there was still one final piece to the puzzle that had yet to be revealed, and until it was, Poirot would not rest. As the evening drew near, and the house grew quieter, Poirot stood in the drawing-room staring into the fire. He had seen many cases in his time, and many lives ruined by greed and deception. But something about this one felt different. It felt personal. It felt as though there was more at stake than just justice. There was a deeper truth at play, and Poirot would not rest until he had uncovered it. Chapter 13. The Final Revelation. The night had descended upon Birkwood Hall with an almost oppressive stillness. The great estate, which had once been alive with the laughter of high society, now felt haunted, its empty halls echoing the whispers of scandal and dark secrets. Hercule Poirot sat in the study, his sharp eyes scanning the contents of a file laid before him. It was the culmination of days of patient investigation, each piece fitting into place like a puzzle, each question answered, yet still something remained unsaid. Across from him, Captain Hastings watched the detective closely, a mixture of anticipation and curiosity in his eyes. Hastings had been with Poirot for many years, and yet, even now, he could not fully predict how the Belgian detective's mind worked. Poirot's methods were unorthodox at times, but they were always precise. Every move he made, every question he asked was calculated. Every detail had a purpose. "Hercule," Hastings said quietly, breaking the silence, "do you truly believe we're close to the truth now? I feel like we're on the verge of something big." Poirot raised an eyebrow, his steeple of fingers poised as he regarded his friend. "Indeed, Hastings, we are very close. But do not let the proximity fool you. The final truth can often be the hardest to uncover, for it is often the last thing anyone expects." The fire crackled in the hearth, and Poirot allowed himself a small sigh as he closed the file. He knew that tonight would be the night when everything would come to light. The final confrontation, the unmasking of the guilty party, was inevitable. But in this case, the culprit was not as obvious as it had seemed at first glance. The web of deception had been expertly spun, and even Poirot had nearly missed the smallest thread that held the entire lie together. The day had started like any other. Poirot had spent his morning reviewing evidence, cross-referencing statements made by the household staff and guests, examining every interaction for hidden motives and contradictions. The key piece of the puzzle had finally fallen into place when Captain Hastings had brought him a report on a conversation overheard between Lady Whitcomb and an unknown man. A conversation that pointed to something far more sinister than mere financial gain. Poirot's mind had been buzzing ever since. He knew that the time had come to confront Lady Whitcomb, and those closest to her. It was time to pull together all the strands of the investigation and bring the truth into the light. Do you recall the conversation between Lady Whitcomb and her accomplice, Hastings? Poirot asked, his voice almost a whisper, as though he were speaking to himself. Of course, Hastings replied. The one Clara overheard. You think it's important? Poirot nodded slowly. It is not simply important. It is everything. You see, Hastings, Lady Whitcomb may have been the architect of her husband's death, but she was not the mastermind. There was someone else, someone who had planned everything from the very beginning, who had carefully placed each step in motion, and that person is far closer to the Whitcomb family than we ever suspected. Hastings frowned, his brow furrowed. You mean someone inside the household? Precisely. Poirot said. "Someone who knew all the family secrets, someone who understood the weaknesses and vulnerabilities of each person in that house, someone who could manipulate the circumstances, turning the truth into lies and the lies into truth." Hastings shook his head, clearly bewildered. But who could it be? Who else could have been involved in this? Poirot's eyes sparkled with quiet resolve. "That, mon ami, is what we are about to uncover. We will have our answers tonight, Hastings. Tonight all will be revealed." As the evening drew on, the two detectives made their way to the drawing-room, where the remaining guests had been summoned for the final gathering. Lady Whitcomb was already seated, her demeanour as composed as ever, though her eyes flickered with barely contained anxiety. She was no longer the picture of poise and grace that had greeted Poirot on his first arrival at Birkwood Hall. The guilt that weighed on her was palpable, even though she maintained the facade of the perfect widow. Beside her sat her brother, Sir Edward Cartwright, a man with a sharp intellect and an even sharper temper. He had been one of the prime suspects in the case, his ties to the deceased Lord Whitcomb strained by an old family feud, but Poirot had ruled him out, or so he had thought. In the corner of the room, Mrs. Blackwood, the housekeeper, stood quietly, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She had served the Whitcomb family for years, but Poirot had always sensed that there was more to her than met the eye. Her quiet, unassuming nature had concealed something far more dangerous beneath the surface. The final guest in the room was Mr. Hargrove, the butler, whose stoic demeanour had remained unchanged throughout the investigation. Like Mrs. Blackwood, he had been a loyal servant of the Whitcomb family for many years, and Poirot had reason to believe that he too was hiding something. With a quick, deliberate motion, Poirot turned to face the assembled group, his gaze sweeping over each person present. It was time to reveal the truth. Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice calm and measured, "I have gathered you all here this evening for a final reckoning. The truth about Lord Whitcomb's death, the mystery that has plagued this house for so long, will now be laid bare." Lady Whitcomb's lips pressed together in a thin line, her gaze hardening as she met Poirot's eyes. "I have nothing to hide," she said quietly, though there was a tremor in her voice. Poirot smiled, his eyes gleaming with a quiet satisfaction. "Ah, but madam, you are mistaken. You see, you have hidden far more than you realize. You were not the only one with a motive, were you?" The room fell silent, each person's breath held as Poirot continued. Lord Whitcomb's death was not the result of a simple disagreement, nor was it motivated purely by greed or revenge. No, it was a far more intricate plan, woven carefully over time. A plan that relied not only on your actions, madam, but also on the complicity of someone within this very room. Lady Whitcomb's face paled, and she looked away, her hands tightening in her lap. Sir Edward Cartwright shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting from Poirot to his sister. Mrs. Blackwood stood rigidly, her expression unreadable, while Mr. Hargrove's face remained impassive. Poirot stepped forward, his every movement deliberate. "Lady Whitcomb, you were the instrument of your husband's death, yes, but you did not act alone. The true mastermind behind this plot, the one who directed you, who ensured everything unfolded according to plan, was none other than Mr. Hargrove." The room erupted into gasps of disbelief. Mr. Hargrove's face turned a shade paler, his usual calm demeanour faltering for the first time since Poirot had met him. His eyes locked onto Poirot's with a mixture of anger and fear. "Impossible," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "You're wrong. I had nothing to do with this." Poirot's smile remained unchanged. "Ah, mon ami, you can deny it all you want, but the truth is undeniable. You were the one who manipulated the entire situation. You knew the Whitcomb family's darkest secrets, and you used that knowledge to orchestrate the murder." Hastings stepped forward, his voice full of disbelief. "But why, Hargrove? Why would you do this?" Poirot raised his hand, silencing Hastings. "Do you not see, Hastings? Mr. Hargrove had the most to gain from Lord Whitcomb's death. He had known for years that the Whitcomb family's wealth was tied up in a series of secret investments that had been mismanaged and were on the verge of collapse. Lady Whitcomb's marriage to Lord Whitcomb had been a cover, a way to ensure that the family's fortunes remained intact. But Mr. Hargrove saw an opportunity. Poirot turned back to Hargrove, his eyes filled with quiet contempt. "You knew that Lady Whitcomb was desperate, that she would do anything to protect her status, and you took advantage of that. You convinced her to take the life of her husband in exchange for a promise of financial security, a promise that you had no intention of keeping. But you needed someone to blame, so you played the role of the loyal butler, the one who would never be suspected. You helped cover up the crime, carefully distancing yourself from the scene while all the while manipulating the evidence to point to your mistress." Hargrove opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His face twisted in a mixture of rage and fear, and for a moment it seemed as though he might strike out at Poirot. "You are wrong," he finally said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I was just trying to protect myself. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Poirot's eyes softened for a brief moment, though his words remained unyielding. "It is too late for apologies, mon ami. You played your part in this tragedy, and now you will face the consequences." With the final pieces of the puzzle in place, Poirot turned to the others in the room. "The truth has been revealed. The murder of Lord Whitcomb was the work of a man who betrayed the very family he served. It was an act of greed, manipulation, and ultimately hubris." Lady Whitcomb sat silently, her face pale and drawn. Her role in the crime had been exposed, and now all that was left for her was to face the consequences of her actions. Sir Edward looked defeated, though there was a certain relief in his expression. Mrs. Blackwood stood stoically, as though she had already known what Poirot would reveal. And Poirot, standing at the centre of it all, knew that justice had been served. The truth had been uncovered, and the guilty would pay for their crimes. Chapter 14. The Long Shadows of Justice. As the final confession echoed through the drawing-room, a palpable tension hung in the air. Each of the remaining guests caught in their own web of emotions. Some were resigned to their fate, while others were still processing the weight of the truth. But through it all, Hercule Poirot stood firm, his piercing gaze sweeping the room like a hawk observing its prey. The storm that had gripped the country estate in the weeks leading up to Lord Whitcomb's death had only grown darker, and now, with the revelation of Mr. Hargrove's betrayal, It seemed as though the storm had reached its peak. Yet, for Poirot, this was but another case. A puzzle solved, a mystery laid bare. But as the events of the evening unfolded, he couldn't help but feel the deeper implications of what had transpired. There was something more lurking beneath the surface, something that transcended the boundaries of mere criminal investigation. The room remained silent as Poirot continued to address the gathered guests. His voice, always calm and measured, held a trace of finality as he spoke. The truth is now revealed. But remember, justice has not yet been fully served. Mr. Hargrove's actions may have been the catalyst for Lord Whitcomb's death, but there were others who played their parts in this tragic drama, and they must now answer for their roles. Lady Whitcomb, who had remained still and silent throughout the confrontation, finally stirred. Her expression was one of quiet resignation, but there was no mistaking the bitterness that lingered in her eyes. "You have made your accusations, Monsieur Poirot, but what do you truly think will happen now? Hargrove will be arrested, but what of me? What of the lives we have ruined?" Poirot's gaze softened for a brief moment. "Madame, the law must take its course, regardless of the consequences. But let us not forget that you, too, are a victim in this story. A victim of your own desires, your own fears, and the manipulation of those around you. In the end, we are all shaped by the choices we make, and some choices are more destructive than others." Lady Whitcomb's lips trembled as she fought to maintain her composure. "And what of my brother, Sir Edward, who has stood by me through all of this?" Poirot turned his gaze to Sir Edward, who had remained largely silent throughout the entire investigation. The man was clearly struggling with the weight of the revelation, and his usual bravado had evaporated in the face of the truth. "Your brother," Poirot began, his voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere, "has, until now, been nothing more than an observer. A man who stood on the sidelines and allowed the events to unfold without taking an active role. But the truth is always more complicated than we realize. And it is in moments like these that we must ask ourselves, what is our true responsibility?" Sir Edward's face darkened, and he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I have done nothing wrong, Poirot," he declared, his voice rising in anger. "I have been nothing but a loyal brother, and I have suffered alongside her. To suggest otherwise is—" "Sir Edward, please," Poirot interrupted, raising a hand to silence the man. "Do not let your pride cloud the truth. There is more to this story than you care to admit." The tension in the room reached its peak, and for a moment there was a heavy silence. Lady Whitcomb's gaze flickered between Poirot and her brother, and then she spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me, Poirot, tell me what you know. What have we not yet uncovered?" Poirot took a deep breath, his eyes shifting as he regarded the room. "What we have uncovered thus far is only the beginning. The man we know as Hargrove is, in truth, an impostor. His real name is something altogether different. And his role in this plot was not one of simple betrayal. It was a calculated maneuver to gain control over the Whitcomb estate." Whitcomb's eyes widened in shock. "What are you saying? Who is he really?" Poirot stood still for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. "The man we know as Hargrove was in fact an agent working for a rival faction, one with designs on the Whitcomb fortune. He was not simply after the wealth of the family. He was after the power it would bring, the opportunity to manipulate events, to control the very fabric of society itself. And you, Lady Whitcomb, were his pawn. Lady Whitcomb recoiled, her hand flying to her mouth. "No, that cannot be." "It is the truth, madame," Poirot confirmed. "You see, Hargrove was well aware of your insecurities, your desire to maintain your place in society. He knew that your fear of losing your title, your status, would drive you to make certain choices. And so, he used that fear to manipulate you, to play on your weaknesses. But in the end, he was not merely playing for power. He was playing for something far more dangerous." Poirot turned to face Sir Edward once more. "And your brother, Sir Edward, was complicit in it all. He may have been unaware of Hargrove's true intentions, but he knew enough to understand that his sister was being manipulated, and he did nothing. He stood by, waiting for the right moment to strike." Sir Edward's face flushed with indignation. "This is madness, Poirot. I had no idea what Hargrove was truly up to. I did everything I could to protect my sister. You protected her." Poirot interrupted, his tone cold. "From what exactly? From the consequences of her own actions? From the truth, Hastings, who had been observing the exchange, in silence finally spoke up. But Poirot, what do you mean by all this? What was Hargrove truly after?" Poirot's eyes glimmered as he looked at his long-time friend. "It was never about the money, Hastings. It was always about control. Hargrove had his sights set on a far larger goal, something that would shake the very foundations of society itself. He sought to destabilize the aristocracy, to sow chaos, and in the confusion he hoped to position himself as the ruler of a new order." The room fell silent, the enormity of Poirot's words settling over them like a thick fog. For a moment, no one dared to speak. The implications of what had been revealed were too vast, too unsettling to fully comprehend. Lady Whitcomb's face crumpled in despair. "But how could I have known? How could I have seen it?" Poirot's expression softened for a moment. "None of us can see the truth clearly when we are blinded by our own desires, madam. It is only through careful reflection, through looking beyond the surface, that we can begin to understand the forces at play." Lady Whitcomb nodded slowly, her eyes filled with regret. "And now it is too late." Poirot's eyes turned steely. "Not too late, madam. Justice will still be served. Mr. Hargrove may have thought he could control the outcome of this case, but he underestimated the power of truth." As Poirot spoke, there was a sudden knock on the door, and one of the servants entered bowing. "Lo, Monsieur Poirot," the servant said, his voice trembling. "The police have arrived. They are ready to take Mr. Hargrove into custody." Poirot nodded sharply, his mind already shifting to the next step in the unfolding drama. "Very well. Let us bring this to a close." The final chapter of the Whitcomb tragedy was about to be written, and Hercule Poirot knew that the truth, no matter how much it hurt, had to be acknowledged. The legacy of Lord Whitcomb's death would leave scars on the family forever, but in the end, justice was the only thing that could heal them. As the police led Mr. Hargrove away in cuffs, the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate. But Poirot knew that the shadows of this case would linger for much longer than any of them could imagine. Chapter 15. The weight of truth the morning after the arrest of Mr. Hargrove was unusually quiet at Whitcomb Manor. The storm that had plagued the estate for so long seemed to have passed, leaving a stillness in its wake, a kind of uneasy peace that seemed to settle over everything. The grand halls, the lavishly decorated rooms, and even the once vibrant gardens outside now felt heavy with the weight of secrets long buried. Hercule Poirot had, as always, woken early. He had no need for the comforts of a languid breakfast, or the companionship of idle chatter. The events of the previous evening, the uncovering of the full truth, still churned in his mind. Despite the satisfaction of seeing justice served, Poirot could not shake the feeling that something more had been left unresolved. The case, though ostensibly closed, still whispered to him from the shadows. In his mind, Poirot reviewed the facts. His observations of Sir Edward and Lady Whitcomb, the deception of Mr. Hargrove, and the tangled web of relationships that had played out in front of him. He could see it all clearly, but one piece of the puzzle remained elusive. The actions of Sir Edward, particularly his sudden shift in behaviour after the confession, raised questions that Poirot could not ignore. Perhaps, Poirot mused, it was time for one last conversation. The drawing-room. It was just past 10 o'clock, when Poirot entered the drawing-room, where Lady Whitcomb sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap. She had changed little since the night before, still wearing the same attire, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes, once sharp and filled with a commanding presence, now appeared distant and unfocused. Poirot took a seat across from her, allowing the silence to hang in the air for a moment before speaking. "Madame," Poirot began, his voice calm but firm, "I have been reflecting on the events of last night. The case has come to a conclusion, but I wonder if you fully understand the extent of what has transpired." Lady Whitcomb's lips trembled, her gaze turning toward the window once more. "You've done your job, Poirot. The murderer has been caught, and the truth has been revealed. What more is there to understand?" Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing with intensity. "The truth, madame, is rarely as simple as it appears. What you fail to grasp is the true nature of the forces at play here. Mr. Hargrove was not the only one manipulating events. You too were involved in a game far larger than you could have imagined." Her head snapped back toward him, her eyes now filled with confusion. I don't understand. What do you mean?" Poirot's voice softened, but his words were deliberate. "You see, Lady Whitcomb, you were not only a pawn in Hargrove's scheme. You were, in fact, a willing participant, albeit unknowingly, in a much grander plan. The events of your life, your marriage, your ambitions, these were all part of a much darker strategy. Mr. Hargrove may have used your fears to manipulate you, but you too played your part." Lady Whitcomb blinked rapidly, as though trying to process his words. But I never knew. I had no idea what he was truly doing." Poirot studied her carefully, his gaze unwavering. "No, you did not know the full extent of his plan, but you were complicit in allowing it to unfold, just as your brother, Sir Edward, was complicit in his silence." A shadow crossed Lady Whitcomb's face, and she looked away. "Edward? I don't understand. How could he have been part of this?" Poirot's tone remained even. "The answer, madam, lies in his actions, or rather, his inaction. Sir Edward could have stopped Hargrove at any moment. He could have revealed the truth, warned you of the danger, but he did not. Why? Because Sir Edward had something to gain, a position of power, perhaps, or simply the comfort of knowing that he, too, could benefit from Hargrove's manipulations. In the end, his loyalty to his family was less important than his own desire for security." Lady Whitcomb's lips parted in shock. But before she could respond, Poirot continued, "But even Sir Edward is not the only one who shares responsibility for what has happened. There is another element, a third party, who has yet to be fully addressed." She looked at him with wide eyes, her curiosity piqued. "Another party? Who do you mean?" Poirot's eyes darkened as he lowered his voice. "The police have not fully investigated the connections between Hargrove and certain individuals in London. There are whispers of a larger network, a group with much greater ambitions than simply acquiring wealth or power. This group sought to manipulate not just the Whitcomb family, but many others in high society." Lady Whitcomb's expression faltered, as though she were unable to fully grasp the implications. "You're suggesting that this was part of some larger conspiracy?" Poirot nodded. "Exactly. And while Mr. Hargrove may have been the most visible figure in this case, he was only one cog in a much larger machine. To fully understand what has occurred, we must look beyond Whitcomb Manor and consider the wider picture." At this, Lady Whitcomb sat back in her chair, her face pale. "What should I do? What happens now?" Poirot's gaze softened. "You must come to terms with the truth, madam. You must accept the consequences of your actions, as difficult as they may be. The law will take its course with Mr. Hargrove, but you, too, must reckon with your role in these events. The truth has a way of catching up with us all, whether we are ready for it or not." Sir Edward's study. Meanwhile, Sir Edward Whitcomb had been avoiding Poirot, slipping into the study early in the morning to avoid facing the detective. His mind was in turmoil, torn between the shock of last night's revelations and the dawning realization that his own actions had led him into a labyrinth from which there was no escape. His once pristine study, with its leather-bound books and polished furniture, now felt like a prison. Sir Edward paced back and forth, his footsteps echoing in the vast room. His hands were clenched at his sides, and his brow was furrowed in thought. He could hear the sound of the clock ticking steadily on the mantelpiece, a constant reminder of the time that was slipping away. But even as he wrestled with his thoughts, he could not ignore the nagging feeling that Poirot was right, that his failure to act, his complicity in allowing his sister to be manipulated, had ultimately played a role in the tragedy that had befallen them all. A sudden knock on the door startled him. Without waiting for permission, the door opened slightly, and Poirot's voice, calm and measured, filled the room. "Sir Edward, may I have a word?" Chapter 16. The Web Tightens. The morning after Hercule Poirot had visited the Whitcomb family, the atmosphere in the house was heavy with secrets, doubt, and the unspoken tension of a web that was beginning to tighten around everyone involved. The revelation that had transpired between Poirot, Lady Whitcomb, and Sir Edward had left an indelible mark on the family, and yet Poirot's words were still echoing in their minds like a dark omen. Outside the mansion, the once crisp autumn air had become thick with fog, a reflection of the muddied truths now spilling into the lives of all those within the house. What had started as a simple case had spiraled into something far more complex, each new revelation adding another layer to the mystery. But while Poirot's mind worked methodically, carefully piecing together the fragments of the truth the Whitcomb family found themselves at a crossroads. The fine line between innocence and guilt had blurred, and now every movement, every glance, was fraught with the weight of suspicion. The drawing room. Morning Hercule Poirot, as he often did, when faced with a puzzle that seemed unsolvable, retreated to the comfort of his own mind. The small but elegantly furnished drawing room at Whitcomb Manor had become his temporary headquarters, a space where he could think, reflect, and formulate his next steps. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of the ornate grandfather clock against the wall. As he sat, sipping a cup of tea, his mind wandered back to the moments before Sir Edward and Lady Whitcomb had confessed. He could see the two of them, so sure of their own innocence, so desperate to shield each other from the truth. Yet their reluctance to come clean had ultimately sealed their fates. Poirot had watched them both closely, noticing the subtle shifts in their expressions, the tiniest of twitches in their voices. But it was their shared history that had been their undoing. The secrets they kept were like a prison, locking them into a cycle of lies that Poirot had slowly unravelled. The last few days had been a whirlwind of revelations, some expected, some entirely unexpected. The death of Gregory Hargrove had been the catalyst for this entire investigation, but Poirot knew there was more to the story than the obvious. He had learned early on that what appeared to be a straightforward case of betrayal and murder was anything but. Hargrove had been only one player in a much larger game, and the true motive behind the crime remained elusive, hiding in plain sight. Poirot paused, reflecting on his own words to Lady Whitcomb earlier that morning. "The law will take its course with Mr. Hargrove," he had said. But there were still questions that needed answers, questions that could not be left unaddressed. He had spoken with certainty, but Poirot never trusted certainty without first examining every angle. Whitcomb's room lady. Whitcomb stood at the window of her bedroom, staring out at the fog that had enveloped the grounds. It was an eerily beautiful sight, and yet, for her, the view was a constant reminder of the storm that had raged in her life, both the literal and metaphorical storms. Her hands trembled slightly as she brushed the strands of hair from her face. The previous evening, Poirot had confronted her with the truth, his sharp observations cutting through the layers of denial she had carefully constructed over the years. She had always prided herself on her composure, on her ability to control situations. But now, that control had slipped through her fingers like sand. She thought of Sir Edward, her brother, who had been by her side for as long as she could remember. The bond they shared, their mutual protection of one another, had always been an unspoken agreement. But now, even that bond felt frayed. Sir Edward had been willing to do anything to preserve the family's name, even if it meant allowing Hargrove's machinations to continue unchecked. Lady Whitcomb turned away from the window, her mind racing. She couldn't deny the truths Poirot had exposed. The connection between her and Hargrove had gone deeper than she had initially realized, and her brother's failure to intervene had only added fuel to the fire. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but she wasn't sure how to feel about the truth. The weight of what she had been complicit in weighed heavily on her shoulders, and the realization that her family was not above reproach gnawed at her insides. Sir Edward's study. Late morning. In the study, Sir Edward sat in his leather chair, the dark wood of his desk gleaming in the muted light. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, as though sleep had eluded him for hours. He had not been able to sleep the previous night, his mind racing with the knowledge that his life and the life of his sister had just been irrevocably changed. He reached for a glass of brandy, the amber liquid catching the light as he poured it into the glass. It was a habit he had developed over the years, a way to dull the sharp edges of the guilt that had begun to fester inside him. But as he lifted the glass to his lips, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He lowered the glass slowly, setting it down on the desk before calling out, "Enter!" The door creaked open, and Poirot stepped inside, his usual air of calm authority filling the room. "Ah, Poirot," Sir Edward said, his voice strained. "What can I do for you?" Poirot gave a small smile, his eyes sharp as ever. "I trust you are well, Sir Edward," he said, though his tone conveyed a sense of quiet scrutiny. "But I believe you are not here merely to offer me pleasantries, no?" Sir Edward's expression faltered, and he sat back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. "I know what you are going to say," he muttered. "It's all out in the open. Now, isn't it?" Poirot's gaze never wavered. "Indeed, Sir Edward, but there is still much left to be uncovered. The truth, as always, is multifaceted, and I suspect that there is more to your involvement in this affair than you are willing to admit." Sir Edward let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I never wanted any of this, Poirot. You don't understand. I was trying to protect my family. I thought that if I kept quiet, if I allowed things to unfold the way they did, I could shield her from the consequences." Poirot's voice was calm but insistent. "And in doing so you allowed the problem to fester, to grow into something far more dangerous than you could have imagined. You were not protecting your family, Sir Edward. You were enabling it to fall apart." Sir Edward met Poirot's eyes, his expression one of resignation. "I suppose you're right. I should have stopped it before it got out of hand, but I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to confront her, to confront the truth. I've spent my whole life trying to protect her, to protect all of us. But I see now that I've only made things worse." Poirot's eyes softened for a moment, though his voice remained steady. "Sometimes, Sir Edward, the greatest act of protection is telling the truth, even when it is difficult. It is not easy, but it is necessary. You must face the consequences of your actions, as must Lady Whitcomb. The truth, in the end, will always come to light." The web unravels Poirot's investigation had reached its apex, and with it the tension in the house was palpable. Every interaction, every glance, carried the weight of impending revelation. Lady Whitcomb and Sir Edward had each played their part in this intricate drama, but their roles were not as clear-cut as they had once believed. As Poirot continued to unravel the web that had been woven around them, he discovered that the threads of deception ran deeper than he had initially suspected. The investigation was far from over. The truth, it seemed, was still one step ahead of him, slipping through his fingers like sand, always just out of reach. But Poirot had made a vow to himself, and to those whose lives had been irrevocably changed by the events at Whitcomb Manor. He would see the truth through to the very end, and once it was exposed, there would be no escape for those who had conspired in the darkness. Chapter 17. Unravelling the Past. The fog that had once seemed like a mere atmospheric touch, softening the stark lines of the Whitcomb estate, now felt like a physical presence. It pressed down on the house, shrouding the mansion in a grey, oppressive silence that seemed to mirror the heavy burden of guilt that clung to everyone within. For Hercule Poirot, the fog was a fitting metaphor for the case he was entangled in. He had followed the twisted path laid before him with his usual precision. But now, as the days dragged on, he was aware that something was still amiss. The key to this case, his one last question, was somewhere within these walls, hidden in plain sight. Poirot stood at the large bay window of the Whitcomb Library, looking out at the endless fog that stretched across the grounds. His sharp eyes scanned the landscape, but his thoughts were inward. The game was not yet over. The final moves were still ahead. The investigation continues. Poirot had learned much over the course of his investigation. The Whitcomb family was deeply enmeshed in a web of secrets, lies, and half-truths, each member carrying the weight of past decisions. Sir Edward had been the most forthcoming of the two siblings, but even he had withheld key details that Poirot knew would unlock the case entirely. Lady Whitcomb, on the other hand, was a far more elusive figure. Her composed demeanour hid layers of emotions that she refused to reveal, even to herself. Poirot had already deduced that she was not the mastermind behind the murder. But his instincts told him that there was more to her story, more she had been unwilling to confess. As Poirot stood, his hands clasped behind his back, he felt the familiar tug of clarity that only came after hours of contemplation. The truth was always simple, though it often lay buried beneath a complex shell of deceit and misdirection. It was up to him to uncover that truth, piece by piece. Lady Whitcomb's confession. Poirot was aware that the time had come for another conversation with Lady Whitcomb. Her confession earlier in the investigation had been a breakthrough, but Poirot suspected that there was more she had yet to admit. The truth could not be allowed to remain incomplete, as that would leave the mystery unsolved. And for Poirot, that was not an option. He made his way to Lady Whitcomb's sitting room, his steps measured and deliberate. He was no longer surprised by the intensity of his own focus. Poirot was accustomed to the way his mind worked when he was on the cusp of something important. He entered the room with the same composed air that he had adopted throughout the case, offering his most polite nod to Lady Whitcomb. "Ah, mademoiselle, it is good to see you," Poirot said with a hint of a smile. Lady Whitcomb looked up from the book she had been reading, her face pale, her lips pressed tightly together. She was a woman of impeccable grace, but it was clear that the events of the last few days had taken their toll. "Poirot," she said, her voice cool but strained, "what more do you need from me? I have already told you all I know." Poirot took a seat opposite her, his eyes never leaving hers. "Ah, but mademoiselle, there is more to know, n'est-ce pas? The truth is a slippery thing, and I am convinced that there are still pieces of it that have yet to be revealed. Lady Whitcomb's expression tightened. She set her book aside, folding her hands in her lap. "I've already told you about Gregory Hargrove and his influence over my life, over our lives. What more could there possibly be?" Poirot's gaze softened, though his tone remained firm. "The truth, madam, is not simply what you say. It is also what you do not say, what you leave behind. You have told me of your relationship with Hargrove, but there is a detail that has yet to be fully uncovered." Lady Whitcomb shifted in her chair, and Poirot saw the subtle change in her demeanour, the tightening of her shoulders, the nervous glance she cast toward the window. It was enough to make Poirot pause. He had her attention now. "What do you mean?" Lady Whitcomb asked, her voice a shade quieter. Poirot took a slow, deliberate breath. "You mentioned in passing that Hargrove had been with you at a pivotal moment in your life, after your husband's death, but you did not tell me what happened when he was with you. You did not mention what his true intentions were." There it was. The spark in Lady Whitcomb's eyes gave away the shift in her thoughts. She wasn't prepared to answer, not fully. Sir Edward's hidden motive. The tension in the air deepened as Poirot prepared to confront Sir Edward once again. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but Poirot knew that Sir Edward held the final piece, the one that would bind everything together. The connections between the Whitcomb family, Hargrove, and the hidden forces manipulating them were growing clearer. But Poirot was still far from satisfied. Sir Edward's reluctance to fully open up had been a key factor in prolonging the investigation. Poirot could sense that the truth was there, but Sir Edward was unwilling, or perhaps unable, to speak it aloud. The barriers that had been built over years of lies and deception would not be easily shattered. Poirot found Sir Edward in the study. His posture slumped as he gazed out at the fog-covered estate. The man was clearly on edge, his nerves fraying with every passing hour. "Sir Edward," Poirot began, his voice measured. "I trust that you are well." Sir Edward glanced up, startled by the intrusion, before his gaze settled on Poirot. "Poirot, you are relentless. I have already told you everything." Poirot's sharp eyes scrutinized the man before him. "Ah, but you see, Sir Edward, there is always more. Your silence speaks volumes. The truth that you refuse to speak is just as important as what you have already revealed." The tension in the room thickened, and for a moment neither man spoke. Poirot had always been able to see through the facades that others built for themselves, and Sir Edward was no exception. The man's pride, his sense of familial duty, had made him an unwilling accomplice in a dangerous game. But the truth had a way of coming to light, even if it had to be dragged out kicking and screaming. Sir Edward's fingers tightened around the edge of his chair. "I've done what I thought was best for my sister, for the family," he muttered. "But I was wrong, Poirot. I was wrong." Poirot inclined his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yes, Sir Edward, you were wrong. But now you have the chance to set things right. The web draws close." Poirot had spent the better part of the morning poring over his notes and revisiting his conversations with the various members of the Whitcomb household. There was something in the subtle contradictions, the small missteps, that had caused the case to drag on longer than it should have. As Poirot sat in the study, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk, The pieces of the puzzle began to align in his mind. The final confrontation was approaching, but there was still one last question to answer. What had driven the seemingly calm and composed Sir Edward to such extremes? What was the final secret he was protecting? Poirot was convinced that the truth would come to him soon. All he had to do was wait for the moment when everything clicked into place. The suspects were trapped in their own lies, and it was only a matter of time before they would be forced to confront the reality of their actions. Chapter 18. The Final Reveal. The Whitcomb estate had grown quieter with each passing day. What had once been the scene of constant investigation, hushed whispers, and searching eyes, was now shrouded in a deep, unsettling silence. The grand house stood stoically against the fog, as if it too were waiting for something final, something inevitable. Hercule Poirot had, for days, spent every waking moment observing, calculating, analysing. He knew the truth. Hughes could see it, hanging like an invisible thread between the people of the Whitcomb household, each one connected in ways they barely understood themselves. The game was almost over. The final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. Stood by the grand fireplace in the study, the flames casting flickering shadows on the walls, his mind was as sharp as ever, but there was a weariness about him. It was the exhaustion of a man who had known the answer from the start, but had needed to navigate the intricate web of lies to uncover it. Lady Whitcomb's fragile resolve, Lady Whitcomb was not one to be easily shaken. She had maintained a serene facade for years, hiding the turbulence within. Yet, as Poirot walked into the sitting-room, he saw the faint tremor in her hands, the slight quiver in her voice when she greeted him. "Poirot," she said, her eyes avoiding his, "have you found the answer?" The question was simple enough, but Poirot knew that it was more than a mere inquiry. It was a plea for understanding, a silent admission of the fear that had settled deep within her. She had lived through enough tragedies and secrets to know that nothing would ever be the same again. The truth, whatever it was not something she could run from. "Ah, mademoiselle, I have found something," Poirot said slowly, watching her reaction carefully. "But it is not yet the time to reveal it. I believe there is more to this puzzle that must be uncovered. Do you not agree?" Lady Whitcomb looked at him, her expression unreadable. Poirot could see her composure slipping, and for the first time he saw vulnerability in her eyes. She was terrified, not just for the impending revelation, but for the weight of what had been hidden for so long. Poirot moved closer, but kept his distance. "There are many things that you have not yet told me, mademoiselle. Things that must be known, for you see, without these pieces, the truth remains incomplete." The silence stretched between them. Lady Whitcomb's lips trembled slightly, but she said nothing. Poirot knew she had her own secrets, buried deep within her. Secrets she had never shared with anyone. The time was near, however, when those secrets would surface, no matter how hard she tried to suppress them. Sir Edward's last stand Poirot turned his attention to Sir Edward, who had been increasingly distant since their last conversation. The man was on edge, his demeanour more closed off than ever before. It was clear that Sir Edward was holding something back, something crucial to the case. Poirot had always suspected that Sir Edward's silence was more than just a matter of pride. It was a matter of fear. That fear, Poirot knew, was about to become his undoing. The detective made his way to the library, where Sir Edward was seated, at a large mahogany desk, his fingers tapping nervously on the surface. The room was dark, the only light coming from the dying embers in the hearth. Poirot entered with his usual precision, his movements measured calm. Sir Edward did not look up, but Poirot could see the tension in his shoulders. "Sir Edward," Poirot began, his voice smooth but firm, "I trust you are well." Sir Edward gave a half-hearted chuckle, though it lacked any real humour. "Oh, Poirot, always the polite one. But well? I cannot say that I am well. I am far from it." Poirot paused, his gaze never leaving the man's face. "Ah, but we both know that you are not well, because you are carrying a heavy burden, is that not so?" Sir Edward stiffened, his gaze flickering to the side. Poirot's words had hit their mark. He knew exactly where to strike, and Sir Edward was revealing his guilt without even realizing it. "You have been avoiding the truth, Sir Edward," Poirot continued. "It is time for you to face it. There is no more room for denial." For Tyranthup, a moment, the room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Then Sir Edward finally spoke, his voice low and strained. I never meant for any of this to happen," he muttered, almost as if speaking to himself. "I only wanted to protect her. I never imagined it would go this far." Poirot's gaze softened. "Protect her? You do not protect someone by allowing them to live in the shadow of lies. The truth, Sir Edward, always comes to light in the end." Sir Edward's eyes were filled with regret. "I didn't want to see her hurt. But I didn't know what else to do. I thought it would be easier this way." Poirot's mind raced. There it was, the first crack in Sir Edward's stoic facade. The truth was finally surfacing, and Poirot could sense that the final confession was near, the moment of truth. It was time. The investigation had come full circle, and the pieces of the puzzle were finally clicking into place. Poirot gathered the remaining members of the household in the grand drawing-room, each person a suspect, each one holding on to their own version of the truth. The atmosphere was tense, and the air was thick with the weight of anticipation. Lady Whitcomb, Sir Edward, and the other individuals who had been involved in the tangled web of secrets stood before Poirot. Their faces were a mixture of fear, guilt, and anxiety. They knew that the moment they had all been dreading had arrived. Poirot stood at the centre of the room, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His eyes scanned the group before him, noting the subtle shifts in their expressions. The time for games was over. The truth was about to be revealed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding, "the time has come for you to hear the truth about the murder, the theft, and the web of deceit that has ensnared you all." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Then he continued, "I have pieced together the clues, the contradictions, and the motives. I have listened to your stories, your alibis, your lies, and now I can reveal what has been hidden from you all." The room fell into a heavy silence. Poirot's gaze shifted to Sir Edward first. You, Sir Edward, he began, were the one who orchestrated it all. Your desire to protect your sister, your fear of what the truth would do to her, led you to make decisions that ultimately resulted in tragedy. You killed Gregory Hargrove, but it was not the act of a man driven by rage. No, it was the act of a man who was desperate to shield those he loved from the consequences of their actions. Sir Edward's face drained of colour as Poirot's words landed. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Poirot's gaze shifted to Lady Whitcomb, and you, mademoiselle, were the unwitting pawn in this scheme. You were manipulated just as much as anyone else, but your own guilt was not born out of malice. No, it was born out of the weight of your own choices, the choices that allowed you to be complicit in your brother's plan. Lady Whitcomb's eyes widened, and she looked away, unable to meet Poirot's gaze. Poirot turned to the rest of the room, his voice steady as he concluded, "You have all been living in a house of lies, but no more. The truth is here, and it will be faced." Chapter 19. The Final Judgment. The Whitcomb estate had always been a place of grandeur, its sprawling grounds and historic architecture serving as a constant reminder of the Whitcomb family's power and influence. But as Hercule Poirot sat in the dimly lit study, contemplating the unravelling of a complex tapestry of deceit, he could not help but think that the house was more of a prison than a palace. The air had grown heavy with secrets, and it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in, carrying the weight of the truth that had been hidden for so long. Poirot had always believed that the truth would out, no matter how cleverly concealed. The murder of Gregory Hargrove, the theft, the lies, it had all led to this moment. He had seen the pieces of the puzzle fall into place, each one fitting together with a precision that only his little grey cells could decipher. And now, as the hour of reckoning approached, Poirot knew that the truth would finally be exposed for all to see. There could be no more hiding, no more obfuscation. The stage was set for the final judgment. A house, divided Lady Whitcomb, stood at the window staring out over the estate's vast grounds. The fog had rolled in once again, casting a ghostly pall over the landscape. She had always been a woman of poise, of grace, but now, in the wake of Poirot's revelations, she seemed smaller, more fragile. The weight of her past mistakes, her complicity in the web of lies, hung heavily on her shoulders. She could no longer deny the truth that had been laid bare before her. Behind her, Sir Edward sat in the chair by the fire, his hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. He had been uncharacteristically quiet since Poirot's revelation, his mind clearly racing. There had been no outbursts of rage, no desperate attempts to justify himself. There was nothing left to say, it seemed. The truth had been revealed, and now it was only a matter of what would happen next. But despite his silence, Poirot knew that Sir Edward was not at peace. The man's guilt was palpable, and his thoughts were no longer on protecting his sister or maintaining the facade of respectability. Sir Edward was a man who had lived a life of calculated decisions, but now he was facing the consequences of those choices. There was no escaping the truth. Poirot's eyes shifted from Sir Edward to Lady Whitcomb, noting the subtle tension in the room. The two of them were linked by their shared secrets, But now, in this moment of reckoning, it was clear that the divide between them had never been greater. The gathering of the remaining suspects as Poirot prepared to confront the remaining members of the household, he could feel the tension in the air. The investigation had revealed a web of lies, betrayal, and guilt, and now it was time for the final confrontation. The other suspects, those who had been caught in the crossfire of the investigation, had their own roles to play in the drama, and each one of them had something to hide. At the dining table where the suspects had gathered before, Poirot carefully arranged the pieces of the puzzle in his mind. There was Dr. Colin Hammond, the family physician, who had been hiding his own motivations. And then there was Miss Emily Blythe, the governess, who had been more than just a mere observer in the household. Her role had become clearer with each passing day, but her ultimate involvement in the crime had yet to be fully revealed. Poirot's mind worked with quiet precision as he reviewed the facts. He had spoken to each of them, watched their reactions, listened to their words, but there was still much to uncover. As he took his seat at the table, he could feel the weight of their eyes on him. They all knew that the end was near, but none of them could anticipate what Poirot would say next. The confession Poirot's voice broke the silence. "It is time, mes amis. The moment of truth has arrived." Lady Whitcomb turned slowly to face him, her face pale. Sir Edward's jaw clenched, and the others around the table shifted nervously. They all knew that Poirot had already pieced together the truth, but the final step, revealing the guilty party, was still to come. "You have all been part of this story," Poirot continued, his tone calm but resolute. "But not all of you are innocent. Some of you, I am afraid, have played a role in this tragic tale, and now we shall see who among you has been the architect of this crime." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to sink in. Each of the suspects seemed to shrink under his gaze, their guilt written clearly in their faces. "Lady Whitcomb," Poirot said, his voice gentle but firm, "you have suffered much, but you are not the one who killed Gregory Hargrove. Your motives, though complex, were driven by a desire to protect, not by malice." Lady Whitcomb's breath caught in her throat. She seemed to shrink slightly, as though a great burden had been lifted from her shoulders, though the guilt of her own actions still remained. Poirot turned to Sir Edward. "You, Sir Edward, are a man of great intellect, a man who has always controlled his emotions and his actions. But you have been hiding a terrible secret, one that you have carried for far too long." Sir Edward's gaze hardened, but he said nothing. Poirot could see the fear and regret behind his eyes. "And you," Poirot continued, his gaze sweeping over the other members of the household, "you have all played a part in the deception. But the one who stands at the centre of this web, the one who pulled the strings, is none other than—" He paused dramatically, his eyes settling on Dr. Colin Hammond, who had been watching the proceedings with increasing unease. Dr. Hammond's face turned ashen. "No, Poirot, you cannot—" "I can, and I will," Poirot said, his voice unwavering. "You are the one who orchestrated the entire plan. You saw an opportunity to eliminate Gregory Hargrove, a man who was standing in the way of your future, and you took it. But you did not act alone. No. You manipulated those around you, and you—" Use their weaknesses to your advantage. The room fell into stunned silence. Dr. Hammond's hands trembled as he looked around the room, his mind racing for an escape. But there was no escape now. Poirot had exposed him, and the truth had been laid bare. You thought you could get away. With it, that your knowledge of medicine and your position in the household would shield you. But you underestimated me, mon ami. And now your deception is over. Dr. Hammond's face crumpled in despair as he collapsed into the chair, his shoulders shaking with the weight of his guilt. Justice is served with the confession of Dr. Hammond. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place. The investigation that had begun with a single mysterious death had led to this moment of revelation. The web of lies and deceit had been unravelled, and justice was finally within reach. As Poirot looked around the room, he saw the faces of the suspects, each one filled with a mix of guilt, relief, and sorrow. Some had already confessed to their part in the crime, while others were left to face the consequences of their actions. But one thing was certain: the truth had been uncovered, and the guilty party had been revealed. Lady Whitcomb looked at Poirot, her eyes filled with gratitude. I cannot thank you enough, Hercule Poirot. You have brought us the truth, and for that I will be forever in your debt. Poirot smiled, a small, knowing smile. It is not thanks that I seek, mademoiselle. It is only that justice be served. A quiet departure. As the authorities arrived to take Dr. Hammond into custody, Poirot quietly made his way toward the door. He had completed his task, and now it was time for him to leave. He had already gathered his things, preparing for his departure from the Whitcomb estate. Before he left, however, he turned to Lady Whitcomb one last time. "Remember this, mademoiselle," Poirot said softly. "The truth, though difficult, is always the light that will guide us through the darkness." Lady Whitcomb nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. As Poirot stepped out into the foggy night, he felt the weight of the case lift from his shoulders. Another mystery solved, another truth uncovered. And as always, Poirot walked away with his head held high, his little grey cells satisfied once again. Chapter 20. The Reckoning. The Whitcomb estate had fallen eerily quiet after the events of the past few days. The weight of the truth that had come to light hung over the house, its atmosphere thick with the remnants of betrayal and deceit. The guests who had once been so full of lively conversation now sat in silence, each of them retreating into their own thoughts, haunted by the revelations of the previous night. Hercule Poirot had completed his work with the precision of a master, his keen mind having uncovered the hidden motives of those around him. But now, as the echoes of his investigation faded, he found himself reflecting on the complexities of the human heart. What drove people to commit acts of such heinousness? Was it greed, power, or simply the desperate need to protect a secret at any cost? Poirot had solved the case, but it was clear that the damage caused by the truth would not be easily undone. The Whitcomb family, once a symbol of wealth and respectability, was now fractured beyond repair, and though justice had been served, it was a hollow victory for those involved. As Poirot sat in his modest room, overlooking the estate's gardens, he heard a soft knock at the door. He stood, straightened his suit, and opened it to reveal Lady Whitcomb, her face drawn and weary, yet with a faint glimmer of determination in her eyes. Lady Whitcomb's resolve. Poirot, and she began softly, her voice carrying the weight of an unspoken question. Do you have a moment? Always, mademoiselle. Come in, Poirot said, gesturing to the chair before the fireplace. You seem troubled. Is it the case? Or perhaps something else? Lady Whitcomb took a deep breath before sitting down. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, and her gaze was fixed somewhere beyond Poirot's shoulder, as though she were searching for something in the empty space of the room. I never thought it would end like this, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Dr. Hammond, I never suspected, and Sir Edward, my brother. He has always been so controlled. I never imagined he could have been a part of it. Poirot observed her closely, his eyes sharp as he searched for the unspoken thoughts behind her words. Mademoiselle, you are a woman of intelligence. You must know that people often act in ways that defy our expectations. That is the nature of the human condition, no? Lady Whitcomb nodded slowly, her hands tightening into fists as she continued. I suppose you are right, but what about the rest of us? What of the lives we've lived, the choices we've made, the lies we've told? Poirot's expression softened, and he walked to the window, his eyes scanning the grounds. The mist had cleared somewhat, but the air still held, a chill, as if nature itself reflected the turmoil inside the estate. Mademoiselle, Poirot said, his voice gentle, you have been forced into a role you did not choose, but you are not to blame for your brother's actions, nor for those of Dr. Hammond. We are all victims of the circumstances that shape us, and sometimes those circumstances are beyond our control. She glanced at him, searching his face for some sign of reassurance. And what now? What becomes of us? Poirot turned back to face her, his eyes calm but firm. What now, mademoiselle, is the beginning of the rest of your life. You must take control of your future. Make the decisions that will define you from this point forward. What happens next is entirely in your hands, a family torn apart. The days following Dr. Hammond's confession were spent in sombre reflection, as the Whitcomb family tried to come to terms with the truth. The media had already gotten hold of the story, and though the estate was in the middle of nowhere, the rumours had spread like wildfire. The Whitcomb name, once a symbol of prestige, was now irrevocably tarnished. Sir Edward had been taken into custody along with Dr. Hammond, both facing charges that would forever alter their lives. The local constables had arrived with the necessary warrants, but it was clear that the men, despite their arrogance and defiance, were struggling with the reality of their situation. Lady Whitcomb remained at the estate, though she rarely ventured outside the confines of the house. Her thoughts were consumed by the tangled web of her family's past, the sacrifices made, and the lies that had been told to preserve a reputation that was no longer worth saving. Yet, despite the heavy weight on her heart, she knew she couldn't let the tragedy define her. It was time for a new beginning, time to rebuild from the ashes of the family legacy. The question was, where would she start? The unseen hand Poirot had long since moved on from the case, but there was something about the Whitcomb situation that continued to linger in his thoughts. The intricate layers of deception had fascinated him, but it was the psychological aspect of the crime that intrigued him the most. What drove Sir Edward and Dr. Hammond to commit such a heinous act? What dark secret had they been hiding? As Poirot sat at his desk in his London apartment, he reflected on the case. His mind returned to the day he had first arrived at Whitcomb Manor. He had observed the various members of the household, each of them harbouring their own secrets. But what struck him most was the feeling that something larger was at play, something beyond the actions of one or two individuals. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the case had been a carefully constructed facade. The murder of Gregory Hargrove had been just the tip of the iceberg, a single act that set off a chain reaction. But it was clear to Poirot now that the true story had never been about the murder itself. It had been about control, power, and the lengths to which people would go to protect their own interests. There was something else too, something that Poirot couldn't shake. The involvement of Lady Whitcomb, though not in the actual crime, had been pivotal. Her decisions had shaped the outcome of the investigation, and though she had not been guilty of murder, she was not entirely innocent either. And then there was the lingering question of the inheritance. Why had Gregory Hargrove, a man with seemingly no connection to the Whitcomb family, been targeted? What had driven Sir Edward and Dr. Hammond to orchestrate his death? Poirot knew that the answer was hidden in the details, and he was determined to uncover it. The Reckoning Continues Poirot returned to Whitcomb Manor a few weeks later, his curiosity about the case still gnawing at him. He had been quiet in his observations, not drawing attention to himself, but he had never truly been satisfied with the answers he had been given. Lady Whitcomb received him with a weary smile, her demeanour still marked by the shadows of the past. She led him to the sitting-room, where they sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their previous conversations hanging in the air. "It has been hard," she said finally, breaking the silence. "I never imagined it would end this way, with everything falling apart." Poirot nodded, his fingers tapping lightly on the arm of his chair. "Life, mademoiselle, is full of unexpected turns, but the most important thing is how we respond to them." Lady Whitcomb met his gaze, her eyes filled with gratitude and a touch of sorrow. "You've helped me see that. I've been so focused on the past, on the mistakes that have been made, that I couldn't see the future." "You have much to rebuild, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice firm yet kind. "But I believe you have the strength to do so. And in time, the truth will be what defines you, not the mistakes of others." Lady Whitcomb's eyes softened, and she nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thank you, Poirot. You've given me more than just answers. You've given me hope." The case unravelled. As Poirot left Whitcomb Manor for the last time, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. The case had been solved, and the guilty parties had been brought to justice. But there was an unease within him that refused to be silenced. He had been right all along. The Whitcomb family's tragedy had been about much more than just a murder. It had been a study in the lengths to which people would go to preserve their reputation, their wealth and their power. And in the end, it had all come crashing down, leaving nothing but ruin in its wake. As Poirot boarded the train back to London, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. He had solved the case, but the human heart was still as complex and unpredictable as ever. And that, he thought with a slight smile, was the true mystery of life. Chapter 21. The Lost Testament. The town of Whitcomb had long since settled into a wary calm, the events that had transpired still fresh in the minds of those who had been closest to the tragedy. But, as time passed, the truth that had been uncovered began to fade from the collective memory, overshadowed by new concerns and fresh secrets waiting to be unearthed. Yet, as is often the case with unresolved matters, not everything had been laid to rest. Poirot's involvement in the Whitcomb family's saga had been far more than an ordinary investigation. It had been an intricate dance of psychology, power and deception, where each move brought the pieces of the puzzle closer together. But the questions he had asked, the ones that remained unanswered, stirred something in him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the Whitcomb estate still held more to reveal. There was something deep beneath the surface, a truth buried so far beneath layers of pride, greed and shame that it had remained untouched, just waiting for the right moment to come to light. The late autumn wind howled as Poirot made his way down the narrow path that led up to the estate's front door. He had returned, not as a detective seeking answers from the guilty, but as a man in search of closure. The house itself appeared unchanged, its grandeur now seeming hollow under the grey skies of the season. The stone facade, once a symbol of the family's wealth and standing, now seemed more like a mausoleum, standing silent and foreboding in the gathering dusk. Lady Whitcomb had been informed of his visit in advance, and though the news of Poirot's return brought mixed emotions, she agreed to meet with him. The estate had become a place of quiet mourning, and she had not had the strength to face it alone. The trauma of losing so much, her brother, her reputation, the family's future, had left her hollow. Yet there was something still to be done, something that could restore her sense of agency, a sense of closure she had never truly found. The silent house Poirot's footsteps echoed on the grand hall's marble floors as he entered the Whitcomb manor once again. The house had not changed. The high ceilings, the elaborate tapestries, the cold, impersonal stone, everything felt exactly as it had before. But to Poirot, it was clear that beneath the veneer of wealth and history, something deeper was at work. Lady Whitcomb met him in the drawing-room, her expression one of both relief and sadness. She had grown pale over the past weeks, the weight of her family's loss evident in the hollows of her cheeks and the sombre set of her shoulders. But despite the toll that the events had taken on her, there was a spark of resilience in her eyes, a quiet strength that had not been there before. "Poirot," she said softly, rising to greet him as he entered. "I didn't expect you back so soon." "Ah, mademoiselle," Poirot said, taking her hand with a slight bow. "There are many things left unresolved. Sometimes the truth requires a second look. I have come to help you find that which remains hidden." Lady Whitcomb nodded, her eyes weary but searching. "You know, don't you, that there's something still left to discover?" Poirot studied her carefully, his keen mind noting the faint tremor in her voice. "Indeed, I know, mademoiselle. There is much more to this story than what has been uncovered. But I believe that you, too, have a part to play in this final chapter. You must help me." She led him to a seat near the fireplace and settled herself across from him. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Tell me, Poirot," she began, "what is it that you suspect? What is still left to be found here?" Poirot paused, his hands clasped together in front of him, his eyes distant, as he considered her words. "I suspect there is something in your family's past that has not been fully accounted for. A final secret that has yet to reveal itself." Lady Whitcomb's face tightened slightly, her eyes flickering with something, doubt, fear, or perhaps guilt. She hesitated before speaking again. "There's nothing more, Poirot. What we've learned is enough. We know the truth about my brother, Dr. Hammond, and Gregory Hargrove. We've seen the darkness within them." "Ah, yes," Poirot said, a slight frown crossing his face. "But there is always more. You see, mademoiselle, the most dangerous secrets are those hidden in plain sight. They are often right before our eyes, yet we cannot see them until we know what we are looking for." Lady Whitcomb remained silent, her gaze falling to the fire. The weight of his words hung in the air, and she knew, deep down, that he was right. There was something more, something she had either missed or deliberately ignored in the past. Her heart ached as she realized that the truth about her family was far from over. The letter Poirot's mind whirred as he considered the possibilities. He had spent the past weeks reviewing every detail of the case, re-examining his notes, and thinking about the Whitcomb family's history. And then it came to him, an elusive memory from the first days of his investigation. A letter. Poirot had seen Lady Whitcomb's desk, and he had noticed the unopened envelope resting on it. At the time, he had assumed it was of no consequence, but now he believed it held the key to unlocking the mystery. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said softly, breaking the silence, "I believe I know what we must do. There is a letter, is there not? One that you have yet to open?" Lady Whitcomb's eyes widened, and for a brief moment she looked almost startled. "How did you—" Poirot raised a hand to stop her, his eyes narrowing with a quiet intensity. "I saw it, mademoiselle. It is important. You must open it now. There is no time to waste." With a hesitant breath, Lady Whitcomb reached for the envelope. The wax seal had already been broken, but she had never brought herself to read it. Slowly, she tore open the flap and withdrew the single sheet of paper, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The secret of the family. The letter was brief, written in a flowing, elegant hand that was unmistakably familiar. It read, "Dearest Emily, I hope this letter finds you well. There are matters of great importance that we must discuss, but I fear it must wait until the proper time. You have been kept in the dark about certain things for far too long, and you must be prepared for what is to come. The truth about your brother's dealings is only the beginning. There are deeper currents at play, currents that extend far, beyond the Whitcomb estate, and touch upon matters of inheritance, legacy, and blood. I beg of you, do not be fooled by appearances. Your brother was not the only one who had secrets. There are others in your family who have kept their own histories hidden from you. When the time comes, you must be ready to make a choice that will determine the future of your family and all those who are involved. I cannot say more now, but you will understand when the time is right. Yours, a friend." Lady Whitcomb stared at the letter, her breath catching in her throat. This is impossible," she whispered. "It's from someone I don't know. Who could have written such a thing?" Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the letter, taking in every detail. There was no signature, no return address. The language was cryptic, and yet there was something deeply familiar about it, something that suggested that the person who had written it knew far more than they. "Let on, mademoiselle," Poirot said, his voice steady but filled with an unspoken urgency. "This letter changes everything. This is the piece we have been missing. The truth is far from over." The game of shadows, as Lady Whitcomb read the letter over and over. Again, Poirot stood, his mind racing with the possibilities. The words on the page spoke of a conspiracy that reached far beyond the confines of the estate, a web of secrets so vast and entangled that it would take all of his skill and experience to unravel it. This was no longer just about a single murder, or even a series of personal betrayals. The stakes had risen dramatically, and Poirot knew that the game he had been playing was far from over. Turning toward Lady Whitcomb, Poirot spoke with an intensity he had not shown before. "Mademoiselle, we must find out who wrote this letter. It is the key to everything. The family's future